From the visceral punch and kick spectacle of Mortal Kombat 1 to the ambitious 3D leap of Mortal Kombat 4 and the strange detours that followed with Special Forces of Mortal Kombat Gold, this is a blood-soaked saga of evolution, ambition and occasional disaster. With most of the early games now bundled together in the Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection, there's no better time to revisit the rise of this legendary franchise. Over the next few hours, we'll explore the highs, lows, and tremors of a series that reshaped the entire fighting game genre, pinpointing the moment when everything clicked and the times when the gears unmistakably began to grind. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is Mortal Kombat's early legacy. Yeah. With the 16-bit console wars raging, the early 90s were a glorious time to be a gamer, and the best part, thanks to my links below, you can relive that golden era yourself for next to nothing. Pick up Marvel vs Capcom Fighting Collection with 61% off. Enjoy up to 80% off the Capcom Fighting Collection and beat 'em up bundles. 78% off the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection, 78% off the Cowabunga Collection, and plenty more. If you love gaming history, you won't be disappointed. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy this ultra-long dive into the bloody beginnings of Mortal Kombat. Today, Mortal Kombat stands as one of the biggest fighting game franchises in the world. It's a global juggernaut, with blockbuster sequels, spin-offs, cartoons, live-action films, and modern entries still landing in the hands of players as recently as, well, right now. It's one of the most iconic series in the genre's entire history, but the path to superstardom, that wasn't quite so flawless. Back in 1992, when the original arcade Mortal Kombat first hit the cabinets, many assumed it was just a brutal response to Street Fighter 2. The two games looked similar at a glance: life bars, special moves, rounds, and with Capcom's Fighter releasing a year earlier, the assumption seemed logical. But here's the twist: Mortal Kombat was already in development before Street Fighter 2 even existed. Sure, it may have taken some inspiration later on, but its real roots go back even further. According to creators Ed Boon and John Tobias, the spark that lit the fire came from a different source entirely. Karate Champ, a 1984 arcade game by Technos that's widely considered the very first one-on-one martial arts fighter. That game didn't just inspire Mortal Kombat, it also laid the groundwork for the original Street Fighter in 1987 too. Boon and Tobias wanted to modernise Karate Champ of the 90s. Gritty, cinematic, and full of ninjas. Their pitch: a digitised fighting game unlike anything else on the market. Midway, however, wasn't sold. They initially shot it down, believing that one-on-one fighters were too simple, too basic, and frankly, not worth the risk. However, Midway did want to experiment with digitised characters, not just in fighting games. In fact, they were desperate to land a tie-in deal with an upcoming action film, Universal Soldier. Their vision: an arcade spectacle starring none other than Jean-Claude Van Damme, fully digitised as the game's main playable character. It was supposed to be a landmark moment, an interactive Hollywood blockbuster for the arcade scene, but then the deal fell apart. The problem lied with the fact that Van Damme was already deep in negotiations to star in a different video game. And with both that and Universal Soldier's tie-in collapsing into nothing, Midway were left with no Van Damme and no game. That setback, however, became a turning point. The combination of Street Fighter 2's explosion in popularity and the lingering desire to make a digitised martial arts game finally convinced Midway maybe Boon and Tobias' Karate Champ inspired concept wasn't so far-fetched after all. Development was soon greenlit, and thus Mortal Kombat was born. They had just 10 months from 1991 into 1992 to make it happen. Using Tobias' own Hi-8 video camera, they filmed real actors performing martial arts moves, capturing them frame by frame and converting them into sprites, creating a gritty, ultra-realistic look that stood out from everything else in the arcade. Now here's another twist that might surprise you. Mortal Kombat wasn't originally designed to be particularly violent. According to Tobias, the game's now infamous ultra-violence wasn't part of the initial pitch. It crept in gradually. The game's fatalities, they started life as a response to the dizzy mechanic found in games like Street Fighter 2. Boon hated it. To him, getting stunned mid-match just meant your opponent got a free hit, and you got to stand there like a lemon. So instead they thought, what if we saved that moment of helplessness until after the fight was over? and with that little tweak would evolve into one of the most iconic features in all of gaming history. Now, when it comes to why Mortal Kombat fatalities hit so hard, quite literally the answer lies not just in game design but in cinema history. The brutality behind these finishing moves wasn't pulled from thin air. In fact, you can trace it all the way back to 1970s martial arts films. One of the clearest influences, a 1974 cult classic simply titled The Street Fighter. In fact, Sonny Chiba's character performs a finishing move that shows internal damage with an X-ray effect, a violent little visual gimmick added purely to help the film stand out from the sea of kung fu flicks flooding cinemas at the time. Then there's Fist of the North Star, both the manga and its 1980s anime adaptation, where the protagonist Kenshiro has a signature move that targets pressure points, causing his enemies' heads and bodies to explode like overripe melons. Glorious. These kind of exaggerated, visceral takedowns were a staple in Asian media long before gaming caught up, and they left a lasting impression on Mortal Kombat's creators. Originally, John Tobias only intended for one character to have a finishing move, the final boss, Shang Tsung. The idea was for him to draw a sword and decapitate his opponent, a fitting end for the big bad. But the more the team thought about it, the more they realised, why stop there? Why not give every character a finishing move? Why should bosses have all the fun? And just like that, a genre-defining feature was born. Now, halfway through the game's development, a demo version of Mortal Kombat was ready to show off internally. It only had 6 playable characters, but it was enough to impress Midway's higher-ups so much that they gave the team extra time and extra resources to expand the game even further. With that boost, the team refined the gameplay and added another character to the roster, Sonya Blade, the game's only female fighter, who was added to help diversify what had previously been an all-male cast. By the time the final arcade version was ready, Mortal Kombat looked absolutely stunning for the era, using 8-bit megabytes of graphic data, 64 colours per character, and roughly 300 animation frames each. And as for gameplay, it embraced all the classic fighting game hallmarks we now take for granted: best of 3 rounds, life bars, and brutal one-on-one combat. What was even cooler was that Mortal Kombat didn't just look different from the other fighters of the time, it played different too. The game used an 8-directional joystick and a relatively uncommon 5-button layout, 2 punches, 2 kicks, each split into high and low attacks, and then, unusually, a dedicated block button. That 5th button might not sound revolutionary, but it fundamentally changed how fights played out. In most other games, blocking was something you did by holding back on the joystick, but in Mortal Kombat, holding the block button not only reduced damage from incoming attacks, it also let players absorb hits without being pushed backwards, opening up new chances for precise counterattacks. It made defensive play feel more deliberate and more tactical. And while the game shares basic mechanics like leg sweeps and those iconic uppercuts that launch enemies sky high, where it really stands out is in its special move system. Instead of relying on complex half circles or quarter circle joystick inputs like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat favoured simpler directional taps followed by a button press. This gave the game a unique rhythm, one that felt snappier, more immediate, and accessible in its own brutal way. That design choice also helped pave the way for one of the genre's most enduring techniques, juggling. Mortal Kombat was one of the first games to let you knock opponents into the air, then chain additional attacks while they were still airborne and helpless. It was flashy, it was satisfying, and it laid the foundation for the combo-heavy fighting games that would follow. Now, as for fatalities, we've already touched on how they evolved narratively, but mechanically, they were just as unique. To perform a fatality, players had to stand at a precise distance from their stunned opponent, and input a specific button sequence, often within a tight timed window. There was no on-screen prompts, no tutorials, just whispers and rumours passed between kids at arcades. Every character had their own, and figuring them out became part of the mythos. And between battles, the game even broke things up with bonus minigames like Test Your Might, a button mashing challenge that let players smash blocks, stones, or even diamonds in half for an extra point. And like most fighting games of the era, Mortal Kombat had a plot. Though, let's be honest, it's mostly existed to justify why a Shaolin monk, a thunder god, and a Hollywood actor were punching each other's heads off. According to the game's intro, the evil sorcerer Shang Tsung was banished to Earthrealm 500 years ago. With help from the monstrous four-arm champion Goro, he managed to take over the Mortal Kombat tournament. And for the past 5 centuries, Goro has remained undefeated. Now a new generation of warriors must step up and stop Earthrealm from being permanently conquered. Before even inserting the coin, players could cycle through the cast and read short bios for each fighter, a touch that added a bit of intrigue. Beat the game and you'd get a more detailed ending, showing what happened to your chosen character after their victory. And let's be real, that character lineup, absolutely iconic. First up, Liu Kang, the Shaolin monk and Earthrealm's chosen one. A classic martial artist archetype inspired by Bruce Lee, Liu Kang enters the tournament with one goal: defeat Shang Tsung and save the realm. Then there's Sonya Blade, a Special Forces operative chasing down the international criminal Kano, who conveniently is also in the tournament. You could smell the tension. Then there's Raiden, the literal god of thunder, who joins the fray to protect Earthrealm using divine powers and a snazzy hat. Meanwhile, we get two instantly unforgettable ninjas, Sub-Zero, who freezes his enemy solid, and Scorpion, his vengeful yellow-clad rival who's back from the dead after Sub-Zero killed his family. And just in case that wasn't enough colour swapping, midway threw in Reptile, a secret green ninja hidden behind cryptic unlock conditions because 90s kids lived for playground rumours and secret codes. But perhaps the most amusing addition, Johnny Cage, a cocky, egotistical Hollywood actor thrown into the mix for comic relief. Cage was a tongue-in-cheek parody of Jean-Claude Van Damme, a not-so-subtle nod to Universal Soldier's tie-in that never happened, and ironically he became one of the franchise's most enduring stars. And here's a little twist of fate for you. Jean-Claude Van Damme did eventually get his wish. He finally starred in a digitised fighting game, just not the one anyone expected. Instead of Mortal Kombat, Van Damme showed up in Street Fighter, the movie, the game, playing Guile of all people. Yes, the all-American military hero was portrayed by a very Belgian martial arts icon. Back to Mortal Kombat though, like any good fighting game, it had bosses, and none were more memorable or more fearsome than Goro. Half human, half dragon, and rocking 4 massive arms, Goro wasn't just a brute, he was the brute. He couldn't be thrown, he hit like a truck, and he served as a brick wall between the player and the final boss. And unlike the rest of the cast, Goro wasn't made from digitised footage. After all, good luck finding a 4-armed actor at your local casting call. Instead, Goro was brought to life using a physical clay model and stop-motion animations, a technique that felt straight out of old-school monster movies, pre-CGI. The result, a towering, jerky, slightly uncanny behemoth that gave Mortal Kombat one more reason to stand out. And waiting just beyond him was Shang Tsung, the game's ultimate villain, a shape-shifting sorcerer who could transform into any of the playable characters mid-fight, mimicking their moves and keeping players constantly on edge. He was less of a brawler and more of a final exam, a master of deception and chaos. Altogether, Mortal Kombat's blend of digitised visuals, over-the-top violence, clever mechanics, and unforgettable characters made it the game everyone was talking about. It wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. You couldn't escape it. Mortal Kombat cabinets were everywhere. Arcades, pubs, bowling alleys, even the odd kebab shop. If a place had power sockets and a bit of floor space, chances are Mortal Kombat was there, ready to spill some pixelated blood. And despite the controversy, or maybe because of it, people of all ages lined up to play it. What makes all of this even more absurd, and frankly hilarious in hindsight, is that Mortal Kombat was still blatantly marketed to children. Just take a look at this early arcade poster. It's flashy, cartoony, and practically screams kids come play. And if you fast forward a few years to 1995, in the thick of my own childhood, Mortal Kombat had even been turned into a children's cartoon. Yes, really, it aired on the Fox Kids network. You know, the same place you'd watch Power Rangers or Spider-Man. What a time to be alive. We 90s kids were absolutely the target market. Every single kid I knew was obsessed with this game. We adored the characters, we quoted the one-liners, and we thought the fatalities were the funniest, coolest things imaginable. Ripping out someone's spine? Hilarious. Uppercutting them into a pit of spikes? Comedy gold. But of course, not everyone saw it that way. The game's unapologetic gore, combined with its massive popularity among children, caused a full-blown moral panic. Parents, school officials, church groups, you name it, people were outraged. The concern that if kids played violent video games like Mortal Kombat, they turn into miniature psychopaths and start roundhousing their classmates. And it wasn't just pearl-clutching parents, powerful figures in the US government got involved too. Democrat Senator Joseph Lieberman and Herb Kohl spearheaded a campaign to crack down on violent games, pushing for censorship, content regulation, and even the threat of outright bans. By the end of 1992, a formal Senate hearing was underway. The topic, whether video games were corrupting American youth. Mortal Kombat was front and centre, joined by other supposed digital death machines like Doom, Lethal Enforcers, and Night Trap. Yes, Night Trap, a full-motion video game where you try to stop burglars from breaking into a house using booby traps. The most scandalous thing in that game? A girl in a nightgown, and some truly awful acting. Honestly, if you compare Night Trap to Home Alone, Kevin McAllister looks like more of a threat to society. Of course, the idea that violent video games create violent people, that's always been pure hyperbole. It's been debunked time and time again, but in fairness, and I do mean this, it's absolutely valid to consider that young children might not be developmentally ready for extreme violence in games or films. Nobody wants traumatized kids running around because they accidentally witnessed a spine rip fatality at age 6. If Mortal Kombat was already a hit in arcades, the iconic Mortal Monday was the moment it went full-blown cultural phenomenon. Launched in September 1993 to promote the game's home console debut, the Mortal Monday campaign was a marketing masterstroke. TV ads featuring school kids sprinting through city streets, screaming "Mortal Kombat" at the top of their lungs, a war cry that echoed through playgrounds across the world. It was loud, chaotic and gloriously over the top, perfectly capturing the rebellious energy the game represented. This wasn't just a game launch, it was a movement, and just like that, the arcade smash had become a household name. By the end of that year, Mortal Kombat was everywhere, and with the brand new rating system in place, the game finally made its way to home consoles. Both Sega and Nintendo would host the title, but the versions, they were very different beasts. The Super Nintendo version, for example, looked and sounded better than its rivals, sharper visuals, crisper music, but in classic Nintendo fashion, the blood was nowhere to be seen. Instead, punches and kicks caused characters to sweat profusely, as if they were having the world's most intense gym session. The gore was stripped away in favour of family-friendly vibes in line with Nintendo's strict content policies, not because of the rating system. Meanwhile, over on the Mega Drive, Sega leaned into the chaos. Blood and fatalities were fully intact, but only if you knew the cheat code to unlock them. This version was slapped with an MA13 rating by the Video Game Ratings Council, making it one of the first mainstream console games to carry an age warning. The game would eventually see ports to a number of other platforms, but one of the best versions hands down was the Mega CD release. It didn't just feature full arcade-style gameplay and uncensored content right out of the box, it even included the iconic Mortal Monday commercial as part of the intro, alongside enhanced CD audio for that extra edge. This version was so accurate to the original, it was rated MA17, a big step up from the earlier ports. So now that we've looked back on the early history of Mortal Kombat, one thing becomes crystal clear. This game wasn't just a violent novelty, it was a seismic moment for the entire industry. But of course, this was only the beginning, as we would soon get a sequel. Just 1 year after the original took arcades by storm, Midway wanted to return to the arcade with a vengeance. In 1993, Mortal Kombat 2 was ready for release. But how do you follow up on a game that already changed the industry? According to lead programmer Ed Boon, the mission was simple: make everything bigger and better. More characters, more moves, more blood. The goal was to not only evolve the look and feel of the original, but also finally implement all the ideas they simply didn't have time to squeeze into the first game. The biggest challenge? Content. As Boon put it, everything in Mortal Kombat 1 we wanted to double. Unlike the first game, which had quietly built up steam, Mortal Kombat 2 had the weight of fan expectations pressing down hard. This time, everyone was watching. Boon took special care with the game's programming to ensure it played better than ever, while lead designer and artist John Tobias refined the combat system, especially the juggling mechanic, which amusingly had been a happy accident the first time around. Rather than remove it, they fine-tuned it, giving players the ability to chain together their own custom combos, a move that helped further distinguish Mortal Kombat from its biggest rival, Street Fighter. The team also toyed with ambitious new ideas, including a scrap bonus stage where ninjas leapt across the screen like a chaotic kung fu film, with players swinging at them mid-air. It looked wild, but some things, as always, are destined for the cutting room floor. For Ed Boon, working on Mortal Kombat 2 wasn't just a sequel, it was a whirlwind. As he put it, the hysteria of the home versions of Mortal Kombat 1 was literally all around us. The original had sold over 3 million copies across home consoles, and the cultural impact was undeniable. That kind of success doesn't just boost your confidence, it supercharges your work ethic. Boon said the adrenaline rush from all that hype kept them going around the clock, fueling the creation of a game that was not only bigger than the original, but massively more ambitious in every direction. Visually, the sequel was a huge leap forward. While Boon notes that Mortal Kombat 2 had a slightly darker tone than its predecessor, the colour palette was actually far more vibrant. The game boasted richer colour depth, and for the first time in the series, the arcade version featured multiple layers of parallax scrolling, giving stages a sense of depth and atmosphere that was unmatched at the time. And yes, tucked in among all the blood and thunder was a little comic relief too, but we'll soon get to that. Sound designer and composer Dan Fulden also returned for round 2, this time taking advantage of the William DCS sound system, which allowed for clearer, more immersive audio that gave the game its signature punch and spine-ripping crunch. But honestly, all of that was just scratching the surface. From a gameplay standpoint, Mortal Kombat 2 refined everything. Players could now perform crouching punches in addition to high and low kicks, giving more nuance to attacks. Recovery time was sped up, which meant combat flowed faster and combos were easier to chain together. Returning characters were given brand new special moves to distinguish them from their earlier incarnations, helping Mortal Kombat 2 feel like a true evolution, not just a reskin. And speaking of speed, the entire game played twice as fast as the original, a move that likely wasn't coincidental considering Street Fighter 2 Turbo was burning up arcades around the same time. And then of course there was the fatalities. The sequel expanded this signature feature in spectacular fashion, offering not just new fatalities for every fighter, but also stage-specific finishers, where players could impale their opponent on spikes or launch them into acid pits depending on where the fight took place. It wasn't just about finishing the match, it was about doing it with style. But perhaps the most unexpected and most memorable addition to Mortal Kombat 2 wasn't more blood, it was less. Enter the non-lethal finishing moves, babalities and friendships. These gloriously stupid, wonderfully offbeat alternatives let you do things like turn your opponent into a sobbing baby, or offer them a gift, or break into a spontaneous dance instead of ripping their head off. It was absurd, it was hilarious, and as a kid, I absolutely loved it. These comedic finishers brought just the right amount of levity to balance out all of the grim decapitations and acid baths, proving that Mortal Kombat didn't always have to take itself so seriously. On top of all of that, the game doubled down on what mattered most, the characters. The player select screen was upgraded from 7 fighters to 12, a significant bump that helped give Mortal Kombat 2 a much broader identity than its predecessor. Story-wise, the game picked up exactly where the first one left off. After being defeated in Earthrealm's tournament, Shang Tsung begs for mercy from his master Shao Kahn, the supreme ruler of Outworld. To save his own skin, Shang proposes a bold idea: bring the next Mortal Kombat tournament to Outworld itself, where the home field advantage will all but guarantee Earthrealm's defeat. Kahn agrees, and not only does he spare Shang Tsung's life, he restores his youth and fighting ability. Then he sends a formal invitation to Raiden, summoning Earthrealm's warriors to compete once again, this time in a world far more hostile than the last. Victory is crucial. If Earth's fighters lose, Shao Kahn will seize the realm and plunge it into darkness. And to flesh out the narrative even more, an official comic book was released alongside the arcade game, written and illustrated by John Tobias himself. It expanded the story's lore and character motivations, and was available via mail order for fans hungry for deeper context. Of course, no sequel is complete without fresh faces, and Mortal Kombat 2 delivered. One of the most iconic new additions, Baraka, a savage mutant warlord of the Outworld nomadic tribes. With his jagged teeth and retractable arm blades, Baraka wasn't just visually striking, he brought a wild, feral energy to the roster, and he was far from the only newcomer who didn't represent Earthrealm. Speaking of Outworld warriors, Mortal Kombat 2 introduced a whole host of deadly newcomers. Amongst these we have Kitana, a personal assassin of Shao Kahn and arguably one of the most graceful yet deadly characters ever introduced to the series. She's fiercely loyal, or at least she appears to be. Throughout the tournament, there are whispers that she secretly aided Earthrealm's warriors, and that her allegiance to Kahn may not be as ironclad as it seems. Equally memorable is her so-called twin sister, Mileena, a twisted doppelganger with a dark secret. Her mission is to ensure Kitana's loyalty to Shao Kahn. Deep down, Mileena resents her sister. Kahn always favoured Kitana, and that jealousy slowly festers into a venomous obsession. She doesn't just want to serve Kahn, she wants to replace Kitana. From Earthrealm, Jax joins the fray, a Special Forces officer on a mission to rescue his missing partner Sonya Blade, who vanished while chasing Kano through Outworld. With his sheer power and no-nonsense attitude, Jax added a much-needed dose of military muscle to the roster. We also meet Kung Lao, a close friend of Liu Kang and a fellow Shaolin monk. But Kung Lao isn't just any warrior, he's a descendant of the legendary Kung Lao who fought Goro 500 years earlier and lost. Now, this modern Kung Lao seeks vengeance for his fallen ancestor and the destruction of the Shaolin Temple. For the first time, Shang Tsung is now also a playable character, with his youth restored by Shao Kahn. No longer the frail old sorcerer of the first game, he's faster, stronger and just as deadly, retaining his iconic ability to morph into any other fighter mid-match, keeping players on their toes. But of course, Mortal Kombat 2 didn't just expand the roster, it raised the stakes with two brutal boss fights. First up is Kintaro, Shao Kahn's towering enforcer. Sent by his race to avenge Goro's defeat, Kintaro is a monstrous fire-breathing beast, and the game's penultimate challenge, a true test of endurance and skill. And then there's Shao Kahn himself, the final boss, Emperor of Outworld, and the host of a tournament. With his massive frame, brutal hammer strikes, and taunting mid-fight commentary, Kahn was more than just a boss, he was a presence. According to John Tobias, Kahn was inspired by one of the greatest villains in cinema history, Emperor Palpatine. Much like the Dark Lord of the Star Wars universe, Kahn didn't appear in the first game at all. He was a looming force in the background, and in Mortal Kombat 2, he finally steps out of the shadows. Tobias wanted players to feel the same thrill he had when watching The Empire Strikes Back and seeing Palpatine for the first time. That moment when you realise the real puppet master has arrived. While Mortal Kombat 2 brought in a wave of new blood, it did leave out two familiar faces, Sonya Blade and Kano. Neither returned for the sequel, which left some fans scratching their heads, but to make up for it, Midway snuck in 3 hidden characters, each more mysterious and exciting than the last. First up is Jade, a female ninja dressed in green who would randomly appear before certain fights to drop cryptic clues about how to unlock her. Then we have Noob Saibot, a completely shadowed pitch black ninja with increased speed and Scorpion's iconic spear move. His name, a cheeky reversal of the developers' surnames, Boone and Tobias. Hilariously, in early development, his all-black appearance posed a bit of a design challenge. Staff even joked that he looked like he'd wandered in from a very different kind of game, one involving a lot more leather and chains. And finally, there's Smoke, a grey palette swap of Scorpion who would occasionally appear mid-game, often with a puff of literal smoke, teasing players with cryptic messages. His full reveal was shrouded in mystery, and like the others, he added that perfect playground rumour energy that made Mortal Kombat feel larger than life. These secret characters weren't just fun Easter eggs, they made the arcade experience feel dynamic, secretive and alive. You never quite knew what was going to happen next, and it gave Mortal Kombat 2 an edge no other fighting game had at the time. Behind the scenes, the production was also on a whole new level. While the original game used a humble Hi8 camcorder to capture actors, this time the team upgraded to a $20,000 broadcast quality Sony camera. The success of the first game clearly opened the budget gates wide, and it shows. Initially, the actors were filmed in front of a grey backdrop, with the footage processed frame by frame to remove the background and create the digitised sprites. But as production went on, the team adopted a more efficient technique, filming the actors in front of a blue screen and processing the footage directly into the computer. It was quicker, cleaner, and much more accurate. Oh, and here's a weirdly brilliant detail. During motion capture sessions, the actors were regularly sprayed with water. Why? To give them that glistening, sweaty look, making the characters appear like they'd just gone 10 rounds in the Outworld sauna. It's a small touch, but it helped add realism and texture to what was already a much more visually striking sequel. Further polishing went into Mortal Kombat 2's visuals after filming, especially when it came to the characters themselves. In post-production, the team added extra muscle tone and definition to the digitised sprites, giving each fighter that over-the-top comic book physique. According to the developers, this level of detail helped set Mortal Kombat apart from other games using motion capture at the time. It looked more stylised, more heroic, and frankly, more badass. As with the first game, not every character was built from scratch. The team continued to use palette swap techniques to expand the roster without ballooning production costs. But for bigger characters like Kintaro, a different approach was needed. Like Goro before him, Kintaro was brought to life using stop-motion animation, created from a clay sculpture by John Tobias' friend, Kurt Chirelli. The result? A hulking sub-boss with a terrifying screen presence. While Sonya Blade and Kano were dropped as playable characters, both make blink and you'll miss it cameos, chained up in the background of Shao Kahn's arena, like Outworld's most wanted criminals on display. From a marketing perspective, Boone and Tobias believed that the new female ninjas, Kitana and Mileena, had stronger appeal than Sonya, especially when competing with the likes of Chun-Li over in Street Fighter. In fact, they originally planned to include another female fighter, based on the real-life kickboxer Kathy Long, but she was cut due to time constraints. Same goes for a male character named Kui Hung. Of course, one of the most iconic additions to Mortal Kombat's mythos was never a fighter at all. During gameplay, when you landed a clean uppercut, a strange man would suddenly pop up in the bottom corner of the screen and shout, "Oh!" Batman? Sound designer Dan Forden, who we mentioned earlier. The appearance was completely random and absolutely hilarious. It became one of the most celebrated Easter eggs in video game history, later parodied everywhere, from Robot Chicken to The Simpsons. Soon after the arcade release, the game began making its way to homes across the world, eventually being ported to 9 different platforms, including consoles, handhelds and home computers. Now, we could spend an hour comparing and contrasting each version, but frankly, you've got better things to do. That said, one very important thing to note. In the previous generation, the Super Nintendo version of the original Mortal Kombat was outsold by the Mega Drive version at 3:1 ratio. Why? Because as covered, Nintendo replaced the game's signature gore with sweat. Fatalities were censored, blood was God, and players felt like they'd bought a neutered version of a cultural lightning rod. So when it came time to release Mortal Kombat 2, Nintendo learned their lesson. The Super Nintendo version of the sequel finally included full fatalities and all of the glorious gore, but only in the West. The Japanese version remained censored, with green blood for all characters and a bizarre black and white screen effect whenever a fatality was performed. Grim, but in a less satisfying way. As for the critics, Mortal Kombat 2 was a smash hit. Sega Visions praised the game's direction as sheer brilliance, while Nintendo Power didn't even try to hide their enthusiasm, calling it the hottest fighter ever. Across the board, reviewers applauded the visual speed, expanded roster, and fine-tuned gameplay. Tony Brusco of the Daily Gazette summed it up best: the hype around Mortal Kombat 2 was well-deserved, calling it a perfect blend of great graphics, action and violence. And he wasn't wrong, the game was a monster hit. In its opening week alone, Mortal Kombat 2 raked in $50 million in sales. According to Acclaim Entertainment, it was the largest video game launch in history at the time, requiring the coordination of over 65 trucks and 11 jumbo jets to distribute 2.5 million copies to around 15,000 stores. It was everywhere, on shelves, in arcades, on the news, and if the first game stirred the pot, this one knocked it straight off the stove. Naturally, the outraged machine came roaring back to life as well. A writer from the Toledo Blade noted that both games had amassed an army of critics, outraged by the bone-crunching, blood-spurting, limb-ripping violence now showing up in living rooms across America. But this time it wasn't just the usual suspects complaining. Mortal Kombat 2's higher profile meant more people were watching and more people were offended. One such voice was Guy Aoki, president of the Media Action Network for Asian Americans, who publicly accused the game of being racist, arguing that it perpetuated Asian stereotypes and leaned too heavily on the martial arts trope. Acclaim pushed back, stating plainly, this is a fantasy game with all different characters. It wasn't created to foster stereotypes. But it didn't stop there. The game was also labelled sexist by USC professor Marsha Kinder, who claimed that the most violent fatalities were aimed at female characters, and that the female fighters' finishing moves were eroticized. To her, the game wasn't just violent, it was misogynistic. Now, whether you agree or not, this much is clear. Moral outrage and accusations of bigotry weren't invented by modern progressives. People have been hunting for racism, sexism, bigotry and what they call problematic content in media for decades upon decades. The only thing that's really changed is the hashtags. And if the public criticism wasn't enough, the developers also faced legal heat from within. Actors like Daniel Pesina, who portrayed characters like Johnny Cage in Sub-Zero, believed they'd be paid additional royalties if the game sold well. And spoiler alert, the game did definitely sell well, but as it turns out, no official royalty structure had ever been agreed upon. No payouts were made. So in response, Pesina and several other performers sued Midway, Williams, Nintendo of America, Sega of America, and Acclaim Entertainment in 2 separate lawsuits filed in 1996 and 1997 for the unauthorized use of their likenesses in the game's home ports. So not only was Mortal Kombat 2 breaking sales records and driving media hysteria, it was also at the centre of a full-blown legal and cultural firestorm. In the end, Daniel Pesina lost both lawsuits, despite seeking a whopping $10 million for the use of his digitised likeness. The court ruled against him, and in a bit of ironic revenge, Pesina later appeared in a photo shoot promoting Bloodstorm, a Mortal Kombat knockoff dressed as Johnny Cage. Subtle. As for the controversy surrounding the game's content, Ed Boon remained calm throughout. His stance, the outrage was outdated. He stated, "I've always had the position that the rating system was a good idea and should be in place," Boon explained. Once Mortal Kombat 2 came out, there was a rating system. We were an M-rated game, and everybody knew what was in it, so it became almost a non-issue. John Tobias agreed, adding that they were perfectly content with the M for Mature label slapped on the game's packaging, and in the United States, that approach worked. The rating systems did its job, and the noise eventually died down. In the end, all the controversy did was pour fuel on the fire. The outrage, the lawsuits, the censorship. It didn't kill Mortal Kombat 2, it immortalized it. Headlines turned into hype, and moral panic only made the game more appealing to the very audience it supposedly endangered. Every scandal became part of the game's legend, turning it from a violent arcade hit into a full-blown cultural juggernaut. By the time the dust had settled, a third installment wasn't just likely, Mortal Kombat 3 was all but guaranteed. In 1995, the inevitable happened. Mortal Kombat 3 arrived, and it did so with force. This wasn't just a sequel, it was a full-scale evolution. Bigger, bolder, faster, and bloodier. Mortal Kombat 3 took everything the series was known for and cranked it into overdrive. The visuals were sharper, the roster was larger, the combos were deeper, and the tone was even darker. It introduced new mechanics, new characters, and a new urban aesthetic that dragged Mortal Kombat out of the Mystics temples and into the gritty streets. By this point, Mortal Kombat wasn't just a fighting game franchise, it was an unstoppable pop culture phenomenon. During the early planning stages for the game, the development team actually considered making the leap into full 3D graphics, but ultimately decided to stick with the tried and true digitized sprite style that had made the series famous. That said, the game still marked a noticeable shift in tone and presentation. Visually, Mortal Kombat 3 moved away from the mystical East Asian influence of the first two games, instead adopting that grittier, more Western aesthetic. Even the soundtrack followed suit, ditching the traditional Asian motifs for a cold electronic edge. The colour palette was also far more muted, giving the game that darker, almost industrial tone. Characters looked different too. While Mortal Kombat 2 had blended hand-drawn elements with digitised actors, Mortal Kombat 3 fully committed to heavy digitisation, making the cast look sharper and more grounded. Costumes evolved, with classic ninja outfits like Sub-Zero's being swapped out for a more modern tactical gear, and for the first time in the series, 3 cyborg characters joined the roster, hammering home that futuristic cyberpunk vibe, but more on them soon. Even the backgrounds got a technical upgrade. Many were created using pre-rendered 3D graphics, pushing the arcade hardware to new visual heights. This wasn't just another Mortal Kombat, it was a reinvention of the brand's identity. A darker, more technological, more contemporary Mortal Kombat had arrived. One of the most noticeable changes in Mortal Kombat 3 wasn't the stages, the music, or even the gameplay, it was the cast. Several of the series' original actors were suddenly nowhere to be seen, and this wasn't a creative decision, it was the result of royalty disputes. Ho Sung-pak, who had portrayed both Liu Kang and the original Shang Tsung, along with Philip Ahn, Mortal Kombat 2 Shang Tsung, Elizabeth Malecki, Sonya Blade, Caitlin Zimaya, who played Katana, Melina and Jade, and Daniel Pesina, who was practically half the original roster, playing Johnny Cage, Scorpion, Sub-Zero, Reptile Smoke and Noob Saibot, all left midway after disagreements over how their likenesses had been used in the home console ports. No royalties meant no return. In fact, Daniel Pesina had already stirred the pot before Mortal Kombat 3 even launched, by appearing in an advert for a rival fighting game, Bloodstorm. This cheeky move sparked the rumour that he'd been fired by Midway, though in reality he'd already parted ways with them over the dispute. As a result, several characters had to be completely recast for Mortal Kombat 3. Eddie Wong stepped in as Liu Kang, Kerry Hoskins took over as Sonya Blade, and John Turk played both Shang Tsung and the new unmasked Sub-Zero. So while Mortal Kombat 3 introduced a host of new characters, it also came with a dramatic shift behind the scenes, and a clear reminder that even in the world of fighting games, the biggest battles sometimes happen off-screen. When it came to gameplay, Mortal Kombat 3 pushed things even further. One of the biggest additions was the introduction of a brand new run button, paired with its own run meter. This mechanic was designed to address criticism from fans who felt that the previous games gave too much of an advantage to defensive players. Now fighters could close the distance quickly, adding aggression and pace to matches. The meter drained when running forward, there was no running backwards. This is Mortal Kombat, not the Olympics, and also depleted slightly during extended combos. Speaking of combos, Mortal Kombat 3 introduced the now infamous chain combos, or as they were more commonly known as, dialer combos. These were preset button sequences that once started couldn't be interrupted. As soon as the first hit connected, the rest was practically guaranteed, often ending in a powerful uppercut or knockback move that launched the opponent into the air, setting them up for additional juggle combos. To accommodate players of all skill levels, the game also featured a Choose Your Destiny screen during single-player mode, allowing players to select their preferred difficulty, a small touch but one that helped make the game more accessible and replayable. And then there was the stage interaction, another first for the franchise. Certain stages allow players to uppercut their opponent through the ceiling, causing both fighters to crash into a brand new stage and continue to fight there. It was a clever touch that broke the linear flow of the usual level cycle. However, if the uppercut resulted in a knockout, no level transition would occur, the body stayed where it fell. These gameplay tweaks and features gave Mortal Kombat 3 a faster, more aggressive edge, rewarding offensive play while still leaving room for strategy and spectacle. It felt like a natural evolution of the formula, with just enough new blood to keep things feeling fresh. When it came to finishing moves, Mortal Kombat 3 didn't just bring back the classics, it expanded on them. All of the iconic enders from Mortal Kombat 2 returned. Fatalities, babalities, and friendships were all present and accounted for. But this time around, players were also given a brand new, wonderfully ridiculous option: animalities. These were exactly what they sounded like. After winning a match, your fighter would transform into an animal and maul the opponent in gloriously over-the-top fashion. Sub-Zero turned into a polar bear, Liu Kang became a dragon. It was violent, surreal, and totally in line with the franchise's taste for absurdity. But pulling off an animality wasn't easy. First, you had to perform a new feature called a Mercy, which restored a sliver of your opponent's health after 2 rounds of victory. If you beat them again after showing them Mercy, then you could unleash the animality. In other words, you had to win, and then choose to let them live, just so you could destroy them in a more humiliating way. Mortal Kombat logic at its finest. The game also introduced 3 new stage fatalities, which could be performed in the Subway, Bell Tower and Pit 3 Arena, each one featuring gruesome environment-specific deaths that once again set Mortal Kombat apart from its more restrained competitors. But where Mortal Kombat 3 really pushed boundaries was in its obsession with secrets and hidden content. Enter the combat codes, 6-symbol codes that players could enter on the versus screen during 2-player matches. These codes could alter gameplay, trigger hidden fights, or just display strange and cryptic messages. They weren't random either. Many were shared through magazines, promotional material, and even arcade pinball machines released by Midway at the time. Yes, real-life pinball machines were being used to leak Mortal Kombat secrets. Peak 90s. And then there was the Ultimate Combat Code, a 10-symbol input entered after the game over screen in single-player mode. If entered correctly, it unlocked a hidden playable character, Robot Smoke. This could be done by a player, or more likely by a cheeky arcade operator who knew how to access the cabinet's diagnostic menu. That is, unless you were playing version 2.1, where the only way in was via the infamous EJB menu, a secret developer screen hidden behind a specific set of inputs. All of these secrets, codes, and mysteries only added to the mythos. They made Mortal Kombat 3 feel alive, unpredictable, and full of potential. Every time you played, you wondered, is there more hidden here? And with Mortal Kombat, the answer was almost always yes. By the time of Mortal Kombat 3, Shao Kahn was tired of losing after being defeated by Liu Kang in the Outworld tournament. The evil emperor decided it was time to play his trump card, enacting a 10,000-year-old plan that had been lying in wait. The scheme? He would have his shadow priests, led by Shang Tsung, resurrect his long-dead queen Sindel, who had died young under mysterious circumstances. But instead of reviving her in Outworld, her reincarnation would take place in Earthrealm. This loophole would allow Shao Kahn to physically cross into Earthrealm without breaking the rules of Mortal Kombat, using Sindel's presence as a bridge between worlds. And the moment she returned, all hell broke loose. Kahn reached across the dimensional veil and pulled Sindel back into his control, and in doing so began merging Earthrealm with Outworld. The result was devastating. Billions of souls were ripped from their bodies, leaving Earth a broken wasteland under siege. Only a few were spared, protected by Raiden, Earthrealm's guardian. But Raiden could only do so much. His power didn't extend into the Outworld, and now that Earth was potentially merged with it, he was powerless to directly intervene. Instead, he turned to Earth's surviving warriors, fighters strong enough to resist Shao Kahn's influence and face his wrath head-on. To wipe out the last of humanity, Kahn deployed extermination squads, hell-bent on hunting down and eliminating the survivors one by one. Raiden could protect their souls, but not their bodies. The warriors would have to fend for themselves. Only by defeating Shao Kahn could Earthrealm be restored. Out of the host of newcomers joining the roster, we have Cyrax, portrayed by Sal DeVita. He is one of 3 cybernetically enhanced assassins sent by the Lin Kuei clan. Outfitted in bright yellow armor and loaded with internal weapon systems, Cyrax was designed to hunt and eliminate rogue warriors, including his former ally Sub-Zero. He may be a machine, but what little humanity remains inside him is beneath buried layers of metal and code. Then there's Cabal, played by Richard Divizio, a former member of the Black Dragon crime syndicate who now walks a different path. Horribly scarred and kept alive by a breathing apparatus, Cabal fights using dual hook swords and lightning speed. Once a villain, now something more ambiguous, Cabal walks the line between anti-hero and survivor. Nightwolf, also portrayed by Sal DeVita, is a Native American shaman and spiritual warrior. With the power to summon ethereal weapons and channel energy from the Great Spirit, Nightwolf serves as one of Earthrealm's most notable defenders. Sector, the red-clad predecessor to Cyrax, is the first of the Lin Kuei's cybernetic experiments, ruthless, emotionless and utterly loyal to his programming. Sector is the embodiment of the clan's vision for the future, a perfect killing machine. He's a walking death engine armed with missiles and flamethrowers and will stop at nothing to eliminate his targets. Sindel, mentioned earlier, portrayed by Leah Montelongo, is the resurrected queen of Edenia and the key to Shao Kahn's invasion of Earthrealm. Though originally named Musashi in early development, the final version of Sindel is a gothic vision of power and tragedy, silver-haired, screaming like a banshee and wielding supernatural flight. Though she once ruled peacefully, her revival under Kahn's control turns her into a deadly puppet, but behind the malice there's a glimmer of the queen she once was. Shiva, created using stop-motion animation, is a proud and powerful member of the Shokan race, the same four-armed species as Goro and Kintaro. Unlike her male counterparts, Shiva brings a more calculating, loyal presence to the battlefield. With ground pounds and brutal grabs, Shiva was the first playable female Shokan in the series, and she made sure you remembered it. Striker, played by Michael O'Brien, is by far the most grounded fighter in Mortal Kombat 3, a riot control officer equipped with grenades, batons and a baseball cap that screams early 90s mall cop. Striker is either the most underrated fighter in the franchise, or is the most hilariously out of place, but looks aside, he means business. Mortal Kombat 3 didn't just arrive, it launched with impact, backed by what would later be recognised by the Guinness World Records Gamers Edition as the largest promotional campaign for a video game at the time. Mortal Kombat 3 hit North American arcades in April of 1995 like a thunderclap. Expectations were sky high, and Midway made sure everyone knew about it. Naturally, the arcade version was just the beginning. The game was swiftly ported to home consoles, specifically the Genesis, Super Nintendo and PlayStation. According to Ed Boon himself, the PlayStation version was nearly arcade perfect, preserving the speed, visuals and sound with remarkable accuracy. But there was a catch. Sony had struck a timed exclusivity deal with Midway, reportedly worth $12 million, which gave Sony Computer Entertainment the exclusive rights to release Mortal Kombat 3 on 32-bit platforms until the end of the first quarter of 1996. This meant that versions for the Sega Saturn, 3DO and Atari Jaguar were all delayed, with plans to release them sometime in the second quarter of 96. Carrying on the tradition of simultaneous home launches from previous entries, Midway announced that the Genesis, Super NES, Game Boy and Game Gear versions of Mortal Kombat 3 would hit shelves on Mortal Friday on October 13, 1995. It was an ambitious multi-platform push, but not all versions made it on time. The Game Gear version in fact never released in North America at all. Interestingly, publishing duties also shifted during this time. While Acclaim had handled home versions of the earlier games in North America, Williams Entertainment took over the 16-bit and portable releases of Mortal Kombat 3 domestically, though Acclaim still handled publishing in Europe. With that many moving parts, deals and delays, the release of Mortal Kombat 3 wasn't just a game launch, it was a strategic media event carefully orchestrated to dominate arcades, living rooms and headlines alike. According to Replay magazine, it was the most popular arcade game in the United States by May of 1995. And that wasn't just hype, it was backed by cold, hard numbers. Mortal Kombat 3 was one of only 3 games to receive the American Amusement Machines Association Diamond Award for that year, an honour based solely on sales performance. Even more impressively, Mortal Kombat 3 was the highest grossing arcade cabinet conversion kit of 1995 in the US. That meant arcade operators weren't just upgrading their cabinets, they were making serious money from them. Home sales were equally explosive. Williams Entertainment, which handled the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions, reported 250,000 copies sold in the first weekend alone. That figure instantly placed the game among the best-selling titles of 1995. And it didn't stop there. By November 23rd, the Super Nintendo version alone had sold over 1 million units, eventually going on to become the best-selling home video game of the year in the United States. Critics and retailers alike took notice. Mortal Kombat 3 was even nominated for the Video Software Dealers Association's Video Game of the Year award for '95. It ultimately lost to Donkey Kong Country 2, but just being in that conversation proved how far Mortal Kombat 3 had pushed the series. It wasn't just a sequel, it was a juggernaut. Despite the commercial explosion surrounding Mortal Kombat 3, not everything about its release was met with applause. There was some backlash from fans regarding certain elements of the game, and they made their opinions loud and clear. One of the biggest complaints was the absence of series favourites like Scorpion and Katana, which many found baffling. Their replacements, let's just say Striker the Riot Cop in cargo trousers, didn't exactly win hearts. Critics and players alike scoffed at the inclusion of less charismatic newcomers and lamented the absence of beloved veterans. The new combo system, complete with dialer combos, also divided opinions. Some praised its speed, while others accused it of being clunky, restrictive, and too far removed from the raw, scrappy charm of earlier entries. Animalities, one of the game's flashiest new features, were often dismissed as ridiculous, and even the run mechanic drew criticism for disrupting the balance that fans had come to expect. Yet despite the murmurs of dissatisfaction, the game still scored big with reviewers upon launch. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave the PlayStation port Game of the Month, and even IGN, while scathing about the design direction, admitted the port itself was a technical marvel. But not all critics loved it. Some pointed out a growing sense of staleness. GamePro declared it was neither as fresh as Tekken nor as deep as Street Fighter, while Next Generation stated the franchise was in dire need of reworking. Mortal Kombat 3 was clearly the most refined and mechanically layered entry in the series to date. Yet with refinement came a creeping sense of fatigue. The shock factor that had once defined Mortal Kombat was starting to wear thin for some, and the once rebellious upstart was beginning to look like it may very well struggle to keep pace in a rapidly evolving genre in the future. But it wasn't the end of the classic era quite yet. Just months later, they unleashed Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which acted as both a mea culpa and a definitive refinement of the formula. They brought back the missing legends, while also introducing brand new secret fighters, hidden menus, and balance tweaks that dramatically tightened the competitive meta. Suddenly, the game's pace clicked. The returning characters restored the roster's sense of identity, while the faster gameplay and intricate juggle potential gave tournaments a new layer of ferocity. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 quickly became the version of choice, a fast, brutal, and endlessly competitive fighter that ruled the arcades throughout 1996. And that thriving competitive scene with its hungry young warriors and endless battles for local supremacy was about to inspire Midway to attempt something truly extraordinary, an experiment that would drag the arcade fighting scene kicking and screaming into the online age. While the Mortal Kombat brand was still huge by this point, behind the scenes all was not as triumphant as it seemed at Midway's Chicago headquarters. Yes, Mortal Kombat was still raking in quarters by the bucket load, but the winds of change were howling through the industry. The once thriving arcade empire that had birthed the fighting game boom was starting to wither. After all, home consoles were no longer feeble little toys struggling to keep up, they were growing teeth. The Sony PlayStation had exploded onto the market like a glitter-drenched depth charge. The Sega Saturn was crammed with cutting-edge 2D hardware, and the Nintendo 64 loomed on the horizon, promising polygonal wizardry beyond mortal comprehension. For the first time, players didn't need to brave sticky carpets and secondhand cigarette smoke to experience high-end gaming. They could just fire up their shiny new consoles, sit cross-legged on the living room carpet, and beat 7 shades of stuffing out of their mates from the comfort of their own homes. To Midway, this was an existential threat. Arcades had always thrived on the allure of superior power, the feeling that what lived in the arcades was a generation ahead of anything you could own at home. But if a gap vanished, so too would the foot traffic, and the quarters. So Midway decided that if they couldn't stay ahead graphically, they would instead leap ahead conceptually. Their solution? Something radical: putting the arcades online. To achieve this, they joined forces with another Chicago-based outfit, Incredible Technologies. Together they began quietly developing a bold new networking system known as WaveNet. And make no mistake, for 1996 this was space-age thinking. The plan was to create a city-wide web of connected arcade machines, transforming what had always been isolated local cabinets into nodes of a sprawling competitive network. So here's how it would work. Each participating arcade cabinet would be fitted with a dedicated T1 line, a blazing fast business-grade telephone connection that cost hundreds of dollars a month. These machines would then link back to a centralized matchmaking server housed in Illinois, which coordinated all the connections between them. This meant a player could walk into their local arcade, slap a quarter into the slot, and be instantly matched against another player at a completely different arcade across the city. When the match ended, the system would record the result, update their stats, and even broadcast their name on a region-wide leaderboard for everyone else to see. This concept wasn't just ahead of its time, it was practically from another timeline. To put this technology further into perspective, this was basically Xbox Live in 1996, a full 8 years before Xbox Live would actually launch. At a time when most households were still tying up a family landline just to download a blurry JPEG of a dancing baby, Midway on the other hand was attempting to run real-time online fighting games over leased business phone lines. And to showcase this revolutionary infrastructure, they chose the fiercest, fastest, and most popular fighting game in their arsenal, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. The plan was nothing less than an attempt to redefine the entire business model of arcades, to turn every arcade cabinet from a lonely quarter eater into a gateway to a vast competitive arena. It seems that Midway weren't just trying to save the arcade scene, they were trying to evolve it. So let's begin to look at how they would roll out this idea. The WaveNet version of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 wasn't simply the standard board with a modem gaffer tape to the side. Oh no, this was a bespoke, custom-engineered build, purpose-built to drag Midway's beloved bloodbath kicking and screaming onto the information superhighway. The developers at Midway and Incredible Technologies knew they were attempting something utterly unprecedented, so they stripped the game down and rebuilt it for the brutal realities of mid-90s internet speeds. They began by trimming the fat. Many of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3's glorious little background flourishes, flickering neon signs, bustling NPC animations, drifting smoke, were silenced entirely, and various special effects were pared back to make the game's data footprint small enough to squeeze through those temperamental T1 lines. This wasn't just a cosmetic tweak, every byte of data mattered. In an era when most of us were waiting 20 minutes to download a picture of a cat wearing sunglasses, these madmen were trying to transmit frame-perfect martial arts duels across an entire city. Every needless particle effect removed meant a few more frames could sneak through unscathed. WaveNet seemed revolutionary, and quietly laying the foundation for what online competitive gameplay would eventually become. And crazily of all of this almost worked. Well, until the realities of 1990s technology caught up anyway. While incredibly ambitious, the WaveNet pilot program ultimately flickered to life for only the briefest of moments. You see, Midway and Incredible Technologies rolled the system out to a handful of test sites across Illinois and a smattering of neighbouring states. We're talking a few dozen cabinets at most, each one wired up like some sort of cybernetic Frankenstein's mother, humming with the unnatural energy of cutting-edge technology that simply had no right existing in a world still powered by pagers and VHS tapes. But from the very start, the whole operation was held together with little more than hope, duct tape, and sheer bloody-minded ambition. And it didn't take long for reality to start kicking the door in, so let's analyse what went wrong. Firstly, the costs were astronomical. Each cabinet required its own dedicated T1 line, which was the gold-plated Rolls-Royce of business telephone connections at the time. These weren't the sort of things you casually bolted to an arcade machine between selling tokens. They had to be specially installed, and they came with eye-watering monthly fees that often ran into hundreds of dollars per cabinet, every single month, whether anyone played them or not. Then there was the maintenance nightmare. WaveNet machines were essentially one-off prototypes scattered across several states, and the hardware had a tendency to break, sulk, or simply catch fire metaphorically the moment an arcade's air conditioning packed in. Getting them working again often required specialist engineers to drive halfway across Illinois with a screwdriver and a prayer. Even when they did work, performance was, well, temperamental to put it politely. Network latency varied wildly depending on how clean the phone lines were that day, meaning matches could swing from silky smooth to glacial slideshows without warning. Some players reported matches where input lagged by whole seconds, which in a twitchy competitive fighter like Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 might as well be a geological era. And perhaps most fatally of all, almost nobody even knew it existed. There was no mass marketing campaign, no magazine blitz, no tantalising TV spots. These cabinets simply appeared one day in a few scattered arcades with no fanfare beyond the odd cryptic flyer. Most regular players had no idea they were looking at something revolutionary. To them it was just another Mortal Kombat machine with a weird plastic box bolted to the back. So while there were a handful of pioneers who discovered it that were spellbound, the wider arcade public stayed blissfully oblivious. Meanwhile, the arcade industry itself was collapsing around it. The golden age of the coin-op was drawing to a close as home consoles continued to take over. After all, why trek to the smoky arcade and pay 50 cents a go when you could thrash your friends from the sofa while wearing pyjamas and eating crisps? The crowds were thinning, the quarters were drying up, and Midway, staring down spiraling operating costs for a system that barely anyone was using, knew the writing was on the wall. And so, with barely a whisper, they pulled the plug. The WaveNet servers were quietly shut down. The exotic network hardware was yanked out of the cabinets and tossed into storage or landfill. The remaining boards were converted back into standard standalone Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 machines, indistinguishable from their mundane counterparts. The custom software build was never released, never dumped, never preserved, and within a year, WaveNet Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 had simply ceased to exist. All that remained were faint echoes, a few grainy magazine photos, the odd promotional flyer curling at the edges in a collector's drawer, and scattered first-hand accounts from the chosen few who had been lucky enough to stumble upon this cybernetic chimera before it vanished. For decades afterwards, the fabled networked build of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 was spoken of only in hushed tones. A holy grail of Mortal Kombat history seemingly lost to time as mythical and as unreachable as Shang Tsung's youth. But the longer this title was gone from the world, the more sought after it would become. WaveNet's brief, flickering life only made it more alluring. It wasn't just some obscure variant tucked away in a corner of Midway's archives, it was a glimpse into an entire future that never happened. Long before anyone had even coined the term rollback netcode, before GGPO became the gold standard of online fighting stability, and before the PlayStation Network or Xbox Live had even been dreamed up, Midway had quietly tried to build an online fighting game ecosystem in 1996, and, well, failed. This wasn't just a case of a game being forgotten, it was as though the industry collectively decided to skip forward a decade, peer briefly into the future, then slam the door and pretend it all never happened. And so began the legend. Collectors, historians, and digital preservationists would spend decades chasing shadows of this thing. They scoured the second-hand arcade board market, desperately hoping one of the old cabinets might still have the elusive WaveNet build lurking inside its ROM chips. They trawled Midway's old storage facilities, rooting through dusty warehouses and long-forgotten filing cabinets like Indiana Jones with a soldering iron. But nothing surfaced. Not a single board, not a single disc, not a single byte. This meant that it became widely assumed that the software had been overwritten or destroyed when the test cabinets were converted back into standard Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 machines, and even if a copy had survived, it would have been completely inert without the original server infrastructure that had been scrapped decades earlier. It was seen as like a fossil with no skeleton to support it, and the impossibility of revival only deepened this mystique. The game became a legend, not because millions played it, but because almost no one ever got the chance to. So now we have talked about the original Mortal Kombat trilogy, let's talk about what followed it. A game titled Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Mortal Kombat Trilogy was released in 1996, and although featuring an all-new title, it is technically the second and final major revision of the Mortal Kombat 3 formula, following on from the refinements of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Available on PlayStation, Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn and PC, with smaller ports arriving on the Gamecom and the R-Zone of all things, this version attempted to be the ultimate compilation of the original Mortal Kombat era, building on the mechanics and story frameworks of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Trilogy would bring back even more characters and stages from the earlier Mortal Kombat and Mortal Kombat 2 games, essentially functioning as a greatest hits package for fans of the series. The game's soundtrack was a patchwork of music from Mortal Kombat 2 and Mortal Kombat 3, with many tracks preserved, particularly in the CD-ROM versions of the game. However, players quickly noticed that several of the songs didn't match their intended arenas, as they had in the original arcade releases. Surprisingly, none of the music from the original Mortal Kombat was used at all. The CD-ROM editions used Red Book audio directly from the disc, providing high-quality CD sound. That said, the tracks were noticeably slowed down in both tempo and pitch. This was due to the fact that when converting the Mortal Kombat 3 tracks to CD audio, they were down-sampled without properly adjusting the playback rate to preserve the original speed, resulting in a subtly warped listening experience that audiophiles and long-time fans were quick to notice. Mortal Kombat Trilogy introduced a number of new mechanics and refinements to the established formula, the most notable being the addition of the aggressor bar. This meter gradually fills during battle, filling twice as fast if your opponent is blocking, and once full, temporarily boosts your character's movement speed and damage output. It was an attempt to reward aggressive playstyles and further differentiate Trilogy from its predecessors. Several characters received new special moves, often using previously unused animations or simple alterations of existing ones. However, not every returning move made it through unscathed. Sub-Zero's iconic spine rip fatality was included, but completely censored, a workaround presumably done to avoid reanimating the gory finish from scratch. Mortal Kombat Trilogy also debuted the Brutality, a savage new finisher that sees the player unleash a rapid-fire combo barrage until the opponent literally explodes. This over-the-top edition would later be retrofitted into the 16-bit ports of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which were released around the same time. While nearly all the previous stage fatalities returned, the Pit 2 was conspicuously absent, likely for the same reasons as the censored spine rip. In terms of environments, Trilogy pulled from across the franchise, offering players access to most stages from Mortal Kombat 2, Mortal Kombat 3, and Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. However, only 4 classic arenas from the original Mortal Kombat made the cut. Despite the game's aim to be a comprehensive compilation, certain omissions were seemingly unavoidable. Alongside the returning Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 roster, including previously hidden and console-exclusive characters, Mortal Kombat Trilogy further expanded the playable lineup by reintroducing Raiden and Baraka, both appearing exactly as they did in Mortal Kombat 2, with one key update: brand new running animations designed specifically for Trilogy. One notable return was Johnny Cage, absent from Mortal Kombat 3 due to Daniel Bacina's legal dispute with Midway, who now re-entered the fight portrayed by a new actor, Chris Alexander. Interestingly, Johnny Cage retained most of his Mortal Kombat 2 moveset, with the exception of his infamous split punch. This move was omitted entirely since characters from Mortal Kombat 3 and Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 lacked animation frames for being struck in the groin. Despite this, Cage became something of a Trilogy exclusive, being the only newly introduced fighter not seen in Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Boss characters also received a surprising promotion. Goro, Kintaro, Motaro, and Shao Kahn were fully playable right from the start in most versions of the game, a first for the series. However, the Nintendo 64 version restricted this feature slightly, offering only Motaro and Shao Kahn as unlockables via a cheat menu. Additionally, players on PlayStation, PC and Saturn could access alternate versions of Jax, Kung Lao, Kano and Raiden from earlier entries, though Raiden, Jax and Baraka lacked proper run cycles. Instead, they simply sped up their standard walk animation, a rather janky compromise for modernisation. Mortal Kombat Trilogy also introduced 2 new secret characters, depending on the platform. Most versions featured Chameleon, a semi-transparent male ninja whose moves and appearance cycled between all the classic pilot-swapped warriors. Chameleon was unlocked using a hidden button combo. Meanwhile, the Nintendo 64 version swapped him out for Chameleon with a K, a translucent female ninja who shifted between Katana, Melina and Jade mid-fight. Mortal Kombat Trilogy received a wide range of critical responses, with reception often hinging on the specific platform in question. GamePro, for example, praised the enormous roster, the inclusion of the aggressor mechanic, and the application of new features to old characters. While they noted the occasional slowdown and muted music, they ultimately concluded that the game delivered the brutal fan service people expected. Despite its divisive critical reception, Mortal Kombat Trilogy saw commercial success, particularly on the Nintendo 64, where it launched during a drought of competitive titles. Mortal Kombat Trilogy stands today as both a celebration and a swan song for the original era of the franchise. It was the last major entry to use digitized actors and 2D sprite-based combat before the series made the leap to 3D, and for many fans it represented the ultimate culmination of everything Mortal Kombat had been up to that point. Every character, almost every stage, and an overwhelming glut of content crammed into one chaotic package. While its balance was questionable and its gameplay arguably bloated, Trilogy carved out a legacy as the definitive what-if dream match, a messy but beloved love letter to the early years of combat. For better or worse, it closed the book on the classic formula, giving players one last brutal encore before the franchise evolved into something new. Before Shaolin monks dazzled the fanboys, before Mortal Kombat 11 turned the series into a playable soap opera with blood gazers, there was of course this, a game so bold, so cursed, so irreparably confused, it deserves to be remastered, not with reverence, but with a health warning. Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero was Midway's first attempt to spin the fighting franchise off into a narrative-driven adventure, and by thunder did they pick a weird way to do it. Rather than refine what worked or wait until 3D technology had caught up, they bolted a platformer onto the skeleton of Mortal Kombat 3, filled it with death traps, and introduced a control scheme so strange that it needed its own tutorial, including, yes, a turn button, because apparently left and right weren't self-explanatory enough. Critics loathed it, players mocked it, entire YouTube careers were launched on its failings, and yet it sold. Like really sold. This wasn't some obscure curiosity, it was Midway's best-selling title that year. So how did a game that baffled critics and tormented players become a hit? What were they thinking? And is there any redemption buried beneath the ice? Well, to answer these questions, let us rewind to the mid-90s, a time when FMV cutscenes were king, polygon counts were negotiable, and Sub-Zero was about to embark on a solo mission no one asked for, but no one will ever forget. That game was of course Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero, the action-adventure spin-off starring everyone's favourite blue ninja turned assassin, Bi-Han. But what is really crazy is that this was never designed to be just a quick cash grab. This was Midway expanding the brand. Mythologies wasn't just a game, it was an initiative. There were plans, schemes, a whole bloody series of character-focused backstory games meant to give Mortal Kombat the lore depth of, say, a comic book multiverse, but with fatalities, so let's dig deeper. Under the creative direction of John Tobias, co-creator of Mortal Kombat and the Alan Moore of digitised uppercuts, development began in August 1996 at Midway's Chicago office. Tobias, with his comic book background, wanted something grand, mythic and lore-heavy. Sub-Zero was chosen not just because he was a fan favourite, but as Tobias put it, his backstory piqued his interest. Naturally, characters like Metal Arms Guy and Man Who's Literally on Fire would have to wait. So from this we can instantly tell that Sub-Zero's game was meant to be the first of many mythology titles. A noble idea, the only problem, everything else. So what went wrong that would result in such a maligned product? The fact of the matter is that while Tobias was world building, Midway had a small team of people who were also juggling Mortal Kombat 4, the cinematic crime known as Mortal Kombat Annihilation, and a doomed live-action TV show. All of this was taking place in the same 14-month time span. That's a lot going on at once, so resources were stretched extremely thin in the process. Using what they had left at their disposal for the Sub-Zero game, the team had to build the entire thing. Story, gameplay, FMV sequences, everything, while reinventing Mortal Kombat as a side-scrolling adventure on not just one, but two very different consoles. And let's not forget the elephant in the polygonal room here, the 3D revolution. By 1997, 2D sprites were falling out of fashion faster than JNCO jeans. The PlayStation was pushing 3D hard, and most publishers were scrambling to keep up. But Midway stuck to their guns, favouring digitised sprites over polygons, a move that got them flack at the time, but in hindsight has aged surprisingly well. Mythologies might play like a drunk goose on rollerblades, but at least it kind of looks cool doing it. So, to recap the impending mess so far, we had a new game in the mix, a shift in industry, a minuscule team, a ticking clock, and a genre mashup no one asked for. What could possibly go wrong? Well, most things, but we will soon get to that. Taking a peek behind the icy curtain of the development of Mortal Kombat Mythologies, the team of just 7 developers with their 14-month deadline and approximately zero common sense get to work. Into this firestorm walked John Tobias. This time Tobias didn't want another tournament brawler, he wanted narrative, so soldiered on with his vision to create character-driven adventures to flesh out the Mortal Kombat mythos. Think the Silmarillion, just with fewer elves and more uppercuts. With a timeline wide open, Tobias began crafting what was meant to be the first in a sprawling mythology series. Each game would explore a different combatant's backstory and feed lore into the mainline entries. The team had to write the story, build the engine, cast and shoot the FMVs, and mash fighting game mechanics into the side-scrolling format for both the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. And this was from a team with zero experience in action-adventure development. Needless to say, time wasn't on their side, nor it seems was any logic. The result, a game held together with blood, sweat and ice blasts. A passion project crushed by crunch and frozen forever as a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition runs face first into a deadline. So let's begin to de-ice the gameplay that can be found within this cursed relic. From a gameplay perspective, Sub-Zero's game is interesting to say the least, because if Mortal Kombat Mythologies is remembered for one thing, it's not so much the lore of the FMVs or the acting, it's the controls, and more specifically, the infamous turn button, a mechanic so baffling, so aggressively counterintuitive, it should be studied in game design courses as a cautionary tale for the next millennium. On paper, Mythologies was a hybrid, an attempt to fuse Mortal Kombat's one-on-one fighting mechanics with side-scrolling action platforming. The control scheme stuck closely to Mortal Kombat tradition: 4 attack buttons, a block and a run, but instead of letting Sub-Zero simply turn around by pressing left or right like every side-scroller since 1985, they gave him that ridiculous and completely nonsensical dedicated turn button. On Nintendo 64 it was B, on PlayStation Select, because nothing says intuitive combat like pressing select to rotate. The result? Every basic encounter felt like a boss fight against your own muscle memory. IGN called it unintuitive control at its very best, and players quickly learned to fear the turn button more than a toasty uppercut. And that's just a movement. Want to jump? Tap up. Yes, really. Precision platforming with not only a turn button existing, but zero presence of a jump button either. Just vertical input. Try that across collapsing platforms or over spike pits. It's like asking a walrus to do ballet. It's as if the developers were frozen in time somewhere between Donkey Kong and a drunken fever dream, completely missing the memo that Super Mario Bros. Was released. A game that had already nailed intuitive controls way back in 1985. Rather fitting really for a game starring Sub-Zero, because nothing about this control scheme ever thawed out into something usable. The level design, pure trial and error. Invisible traps, bottomless pits, collapsing ceilings, ambushes you can't see coming until you're already impaled, and the fixed camera angles, they don't show you the trap until it's too late. Combat at least gives you Sub-Zero's Ice Blast and Slide, but special moves cost energy from a slowly recharging ice meter. You unlock more moves with XP earned from combos, which sounds good until you realise the combos are clunky and the enemies, teleporting monks, axe swinging sadists, can stun lock you into oblivion. Then comes the boss fights. Take the second stage, Fujin, God of Wind, and mandatory rage quits. There's tornadoes, platforms, floaty inputs, and a fight that feels less like gameplay and more like a timed endurance test of your patience and your controller. Oh, and elevators. Certain stages require you to hold down combos of buttons, L1 plus triangle or A plus C buttons, just to activate a lift. Miss a step, back to the start. Mistime it during a fight, enjoy your plummet. Was it better on PlayStation? Barely. The shoulder buttons made inventory access a bit easier, and at least you had the FMVs to break the misery. On Nintendo 64, pure ergonomic torture. You got the infamous Trident controller, C buttons as directionals, and item menus locked behind the Z trigger like it was hiding your pension statement. In fairness, there was ambition here. The XP system hinted at RPG mechanics, the ice meter added some strategy, but ambition only gets you so far when it feels like the game was designed by someone who'd never touched a controller before. This wasn't gameplay, this was punishment. A masterclass in how to alienate both fighting game fans and platforming fans in one go. A full-blown identity crisis, and yet the game wasn't done. It still had one frozen ace up its sleeve, the story. And wouldn't you know it, that's where we're headed next. If the gameplay was an ice-cold slap to the face, then the story, bless it, was a warm towel on your frostbitten cheeks. Because of all of Mythology's mechanical crimes, it actually delivered where it mattered most in some places, the lore. Story-wise, this was no regular Mortal Kombat game. It was a full-blown prequel, a mythology-expanding epic that dared to answer the questions no one had officially asked yet. Who was Sub-Zero before the tournament? How did he get roped into all this god-slaying nonsense? And why does he hate Scorpion with such a burning, unfreezable rage? The tale begins with Bi-Han, the original Sub-Zero, long before his younger brother, Kuai Liang, took over the role, and long before he became the ghostly edgelord known as Noob Saibot. At this point, he's a loyal assassin of the Lin Kuei, sent on a seemingly routine job to steal a mythical amulet for some power bloke named Quan Chi. Now, if you've played any Mortal Kombat since 1997, that name should be setting off alarm bells. Quan Chi is the kind of sorcerer who makes Skeletor look like a morally complex anti-hero. But here, Bi-Han is still the good soldier, silent, obedient, and a bit thick. Naturally, the job is a setup. Quan Chi's real goal is to free Shinnok, a disgraced elder god currently doing hard time in the Netherrealm. Thanks to Bi-Han's impressive thievery, the key to that prison is now in the worst possible hands. Whoops. Enter Raiden, the ever-helpful god of thunder who arrives just in time to say, yes, you've doomed the universe, now go fix it. Sub-Zero is sent into the Netherrealm to recover the amulet, where he faces Fire, Brimstone, and a trio of goth assassins, Kia, Jataka, and fan favourite tragic waifu, Serena. And through it all, Bi-Han barely blinks. He's ice cold in every sense, killing, obeying, never once stopping to ask if he might actually be the villain. Raiden even drops a chilling line, "You belong in the Netherrealm," a throwaway line with massive implications, because canonically, that's exactly where he ends up. The game also cements his rivalry with Scorpion. In an early level, Bi-Han murders him, as you do, triggering the Shirai Ryu warrior's resurrection as a flaming spectre with one goal, revenge. The player is even offered a moral choice, spare him or kill him again. Spoiler, canon says Bi-Han finishes the job. It's the start of a legendary feud built on betrayal, misunderstanding, and a bit of necromantic puppetry. Quan Chi, it turns out, was playing both men from the start, pulling strings, raising corpses, and instigating generational blood feuds like the undead CEO he is. And this is where mythology genuinely shines. Yes, the gameplay is miserable, yes, the platforming is cruel, but the story matters. It sets the stage for Mortal Kombat 4, introduces major players like Quan Chi and Shinnok, and gives us the darker, colder Sub-Zero we'd follow through multiple timelines. Even the Netherrealm gets a makeover. Once ruled by Lucifer, yes, that Lucifer, is now Shinnok's waiting room. It's not just hell, it's a realm with layers, and Bi-Han's descent into it isn't a hero's journey, it's damnation with an ice trowel. By the time he claws his way back out, amulet in hand, he's not the same man who went in. And how does it end? With a message from Shang Tsung inviting him to the Mortal Kombat tournament. That's right, Mythologies ends where the original game begins, like poetry, or more accurately, a spiral staircase into the abyss. As if Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero hadn't already tested players' patience enough, as mentioned earlier, Midway saw fit to release not one but two versions, one for the Sony PlayStation and one for the Nintendo 64. Same game, same plot, same relentless agony, but each delivered its own flavour of technical torment. Let's start with the PlayStation version, which launched in October 1997. This was the so-called cinematic cut, made possible by that magical little disc format called the CD-ROM. Translation, full motion video cutscenes. Yes, real actors, green-screened martial artists growling through dramatic monologues in eyeliner and shoulder pads. You had John Turk as Sub-Zero, Sal DeVita as Scorpion, and Rich DeVizio as Quan Chi, chewing scenery like it owed him money. The FMVs may have aged like yogurt left on a radiator, but in 1997 they were impressive. They gave the game a rare sense of narrative continuity. The voice acting wasn't bad either, assuming you enjoy Thunder Gods who sound like they just downed 3 monster energies in a philosophy degree.
Your clan's ignorance and greed will cost this entire realm. You'll now have to set things straight.
There were trade-offs, of course. Frequent loading screens broke the flow every few minutes, but many critics, GameSpot included, felt the presentation was worth it. After all, if you were going to endure those controls, you might as well enjoy a bit of amateur theatre along the way. Then came the Nintendo 64 version, released 2 months later. In a word, bare bones. The cartridge format meant no FMV, instead you got static images and text boxes. Quan Chi's sinister monologues replaced with PowerPoint slides. Emotional impact, nil. The audio took a hit too. Compressed sound files reduced the voice acting, and a soundtrack that sounded like it was clawing to escape a duvet. And the controls, as mentioned earlier, somehow got worse. Reviewers called it frustratingly unresponsive. Other people just cried. Visually, both versions were about the same, digitized character sprites over polygonal environments, but with the FMVs and sound stripped away, the Nintendo 64 version felt like a hollow shell, a budget bin port of a game that was already broken. Even those few critics who defended the PlayStation release couldn't salvage the N64 one. IGN called it unplayable. MobiGame users said it looked worse than some 16-bit Super Nintendo games. Quite an achievement really. In hindsight, the difference between the two versions wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. The PlayStation version at least pretended to be a real video game. It tried, it failed sure, but it tried. The N64 version, it gave up at the title screen and hoped you wouldn't notice. Today, retro collectors generally consider the PlayStation version the definitive one, if only because it has the full narrative package. Meanwhile, the Nintendo 64 port lives on in infamy, a relic of cartridge limitations and deeply questionable decisions. Two versions, one frostbitten courts of the game, so if you want to play this for yourself, then pick your poison. The response from critics, as already covered to some degree, was swift and brutal, and often unintentionally hilarious, unless of course you worked at Midway. To say the game got a frosty reception would be putting it lightly.
Frosty!
IGN handed it an awful rating, savaging the unintuitive controls and punishing level design. Their sharpest jab, the turn button, suggesting quite reasonably that turning around should maybe be handled by the control pad. Revolutionary thinking, apparently. GamePro wasn't kinder. They likened the game to a bad fan mod, which honestly might be a little unfair to fan mods. Level design drew particular ire through its commitment to trial and error punishment. Reviewers described walking a few feet before being instantly skewered by traps, falling into unseen pits, or getting wrecked by hazards they couldn't possibly have anticipated. One summed it up: you die, you learn, you die again, which is technically Mortal Kombat, but not in the way people wanted. In a strange twist, GameSpot bucked the trend. They praised the game as a pretty amazing meld of fighting and platforming jumping, even complimenting the graphics, soundtrack, and FMV cutscenes. Clearly, someone there was either very generous or very confused. Still, no amount of polite praise could obscure the truth. Players hated it, and yet it sold. Somehow, Mythologies became Midway's best-selling title of the year. The Mortal Kombat brand alone dragged it over the finish line like a half-conscious fighter crawling back to the character select screen. Mythologies was a commercial success. However, due to so many people playing it, of course, the war crime that was Mythologies was never forgotten. If anything, retrospectives have been even less forgiving. Hardcore Gaming 101 have called it one of the most notoriously awful games ever made, an inept, awkward hodgepodge of clunky combat and torturous platforming, a sentiment echoed by every YouTuber with a capture card and unresolved trauma. And yet it endures. Modern voices like Retronauts offer a backhanded kind of respect. Flawed, they say, critically broken, but also ambitious. The Netflix documentary High Score even gave it a respectful nod, crediting Tobias's work on Mythologies as a foundation for cinematic storytelling that defines the series today. And yes, it's canon. Mortal Kombat 11 Aftermath directly references events from Mythologies. This throws a misadventure, it's official history now. So where does that leave us? With a game that gameplay-wise, by almost every metric, is a disaster, but also one that introduced Quan Chi, established Chinook, and gave us the origin of Noob Saibot. It deepened the feud between Sub-Zero and Scorpion. It failed in execution, but succeeded in myth-making in South. So holding these thoughts, what exactly do we do with Mortal Kombat Mythologies? Do we mock it endlessly as a relic of bad design and worse decision making? Do we tip our hats to its narrative ambitions, like a gentleman at a funeral for a man who slipped on his own spine trap? Or do we simply stare at the turn button and ask ourselves, how did we let this happen? In truth, Mythologies defies a simple verdict. It's a disastrous platformer, a frustrating brawler, a Frankenstein's monster of mismatched mechanics, and yet a crucial pivot point in Mortal Kombat history. And somehow, amid the chaos of broken controls, brutal difficulty spikes and elevators that demanded Olympic-level finger gymnastics, it sold. Enough to justify more spin-offs, the Doom Special Forces, and the later far more competent Shaolin monks. It even laid the icy groundwork for the cinematic storytelling that would become NetherRealm's signature. Tobias would later admit the team was stretched thin, inexperienced with the genre and overwhelmed by other projects. But to his credit, he stood by the vision. He wanted to tell stories, he wanted to expand the lore, he just didn't have the time to turn that lore into a game anyone actually enjoyed playing. To put it simply, this was a game that fouled forward. Yes, it was a mess, a frozen wreck caught between eras. Too 2D to be trendy, too experimental to be safe, and far too rushed to stand on its own ninja boots. But it mattered. It still matters, and it deserves to be remembered, not just as a bad game, but as a fascinating one. A game that dreamed of becoming a legend, and ended up as an icy footnote with a full motion video budget. Mortal Kombat 4, the moment Midway gazed into the bold polygonal future, and tripped over its own testicles of might. This was supposed to be Mortal Kombat's grand leap into 3D. A fresh start, a modernisation, a glorious new chapter, and yet what we got was pretty underwhelming. By the late 90s, the arcade scene wasn't just on life support, it had flatlined, been resurrected by a necromancer, and then exploded into a fine mist of debt and redundancy. The golden age was over, no more cigarette-scented cabinets, no more sticky floors echoing with Street Fighter 2 themes, just landlords slowly realising they could make more money renting space to kebab shops. But Midway would chug along in the arcades, trying their very best to survive. Before Mortal Kombat 4 took its first clumsy steps into the world of 3D fighting, there was War Gods, Midway's unfortunate attempt at proving they could, in fact, render a third dimension without everything immediately falling apart. Spoiler, they couldn't. Released in 1996, War Gods was supposed to be Midway's Virtua Fighter moment, a showcase of polygonal prowess, and proved that the studio wasn't just coasting on fatalities and nostalgia. Instead, what we got was a slow, ugly, wildly awkward mess that played like someone just jammed Mortal Kombat 3 into a toaster and hoped for the best. The game's key innovation, if you can call it that, was a cursed little gimmick called digital skin. In theory, this involved mapping photos of real actors onto 3D models, which sounds impressive until you see it in motion and realise every character looked like a melted wax sculpture of their own stunt double. Limbs wobbled, faces flickered, animations stuttered like a haunted animatronic. And let's not even get started on the art design, which ranged from S&M action figure to reject from a Tool music video. Gameplay wise, War Gods introduced the infamous 3D button, which allowed players to sidestep very, very slowly. The fatalities were still there, bless them, but good luck triggering them consistently when your character decides to moonwalk into the background every time you press forward. The roster was a who's who of mythological irrelevance. There was CY5, a bootleg Cyrax with all the charisma of a fax machine. Vala, who looked like someone dared the artist to redraw Sonya Blade from memory while on a roller coaster. An Exor, the final boss, who might have been an alien, a cyborg, or possibly just the internal representation of Midway's declining standards. Critics hated it, players ignored it, and internally even the Mortal Kombat team kept their distance. This was an entirely separate crew, working in parallel, trying to cobble together a 3D fighter using modified Cruising USA arcade hardware, and a lot of crossed fingers. But here's the thing, as much as War Gods failed, it was necessary. It was the training wheels, the cautionary tale. It crawled so Mortal Kombat 4 could also crawl, but this time in a straightish line with slightly fewer seizures. Arcades were dying, and into this commercial graveyard swaggered Mortal Kombat 4, blissfully unaware that this platform of choice, namely the arcade cabinet, was now about as viable as launching a new VHS retail chain. Yes, while everyone else was busy playing Tekken 3 in their bedrooms or sobbing into Final Fantasy VII, Midway decided it was a great time to release their most expensive arcade game of all time. That's right, a single Mortal Kombat 4 machine cost around $3,000. A crazy amount of money for the time, especially when it was already tight in arcades. But Midway had a plan, a cunning one. They built Mortal Kombat 4 on their brand new Zeus arcade board, a name that sounds powerful until you realise it was getting bodied by Sony's PlayStation in every conceivable metric except polygon boasting. The Zeus hardware was Midway's shiny new toy, an in-house 3D powerhouse allegedly capable of over 1 million polygons per second, which sounds impressive until you realise it was mostly used to produce characters that look like they'd been sculpted out of wet cardboard. To give credit where it's due, this was the Mortal Kombat team's first real stab at proper 3D. Gone were the digitised actors of yesteryear, replaced with fully polygonal fighters. Unfortunately, this meant the team had to completely relearn how to make a video game, except now they were doing it while strapped to a roller coaster powered by a VCR and a curse. Zeus came equipped with exotic wonders like Wave Ram, which sounds like something a Bond villain would use to destroy a city, but in practice, mostly caused memory bottlenecks and spectacularly jittery animations. Every character model used up to 3,000 polygons, an impressive figure at the time, if you ignore the fact that Tekken 2 had already made this kind of thing look effortless. But the real fun began behind the scenes. See, Zeus was designed for parallel processing. Great in theory if your team weren't also trying to bolt motion capture onto hand-drawn animations, argue about why Scorpion's head looked like a rock, and reuse half their assets just to make the whole thing fit on EEPROM chips. That's right, EEPROMs in 1997. Because when your competition is loading off discs, you obviously want to use something that makes cassette tapes look cutting edge. Thanks to those chips, loading times were inconsistent, animation frames got cold, and developers had to reuse effects like Shinnok's bone attacks, which, fun fact, were just Quan Chi's skull with a different label stuck on. It's like if Pepsi tried to rebrand itself as New Coke by drawing a frowny face on the can. Worst of all, the Zeus board couldn't even deliver its full potential during gameplay. Yes, it could technically render complex arenas and dramatic camera angles, but only if you didn't mind texture warping, frame rate drops, and what can only be described as the world's first fully interactive tech demo for motion sickness. It was, in short, a classic case of ambition colliding with reality. Zeus was powerful on paper, but in practice it exposed every crack in Midway's pipeline. The game chugged, animations were stiff, fatalities looked like someone taped over an autopsy video of a PS1 FMV, and yet despite all of this, Midway pressed on, because they weren't just making a game, they were laying down a new path, a jagged, glitchy, polygon-filled path, lined with texture seams and dashed dreams. What a time to be alive. Meanwhile, home consoles were taking over everything. The PlayStation had sold over 3 million units worldwide by just 1995, and players were quickly realising they didn't have to trudge into town and beg their mum for 50p just to get curb stomped by a sweaty stranger in a backwards cap. They could just do it from the comfort of their living room instead. So, with arcades dying, console tech accelerating, and the fighting game genre creaking under the weight of saturation, Midway chose this moment to drop their most ambitious arcade game yet. Ridiculous really, it would have been like debuting a new steam-powered bicycle the year after the car was invented. Charming, but ultimately doomed. But that didn't mean the team didn't at least try to make the game stand out. After all, Mortal Kombat 4 wasn't just trying to look different, it wanted to feel different. Gone were the colourful gimmicks of Mortal Kombat 3. No more babalities, friendships or animalities. Because why would a series known for making people explode into 12 rib cages want to be fun, right? Yes, Mortal Kombat 4 was Midway's very serious phase. The eyeliner years, the gritty reboot before gritty reboots were fashionable. The developers decided that instead of transforming into a penguin or slapping someone into a bloody pulp, which, let's be honest, is peak art, players should instead enjoy grime, somber violence in dull stone arenas, accompanied by music that sounded like Gregorian monks being slowly digested. Animalities were the first to get the chop. All the absurd little nuggets of charm that told you Mortal Kombat didn't take itself too seriously were removed, all scrapped in favour of mature storytelling. The new aesthetic, gloomy, muddy, and determined to be taken seriously. As for the music, composer Dan Forden ditched the catchy techno riffs in favour of moody ambience and tribal drums. It was atmospheric, sure, but also about as fun as being stuck in a lift with a metronome and the ghost of Trent Reznor. Even the characters got caught in the tonal crossfire. The problem wasn't that Mortal Kombat 4 tried to be darker, it's that it confused darkness with dullness. There's a fine line between brooding atmosphere and a wet cardboard box, and Mortal Kombat 4 sprinted straight through it, weapon in hand. Still, credit where it's due, the devs had a vision. They wanted Mortal Kombat to be more than a blood circus. They wanted mythos, gravitas, consequence. Unfortunately, what they ended up with was Shinnok, a final boss who looked and sounded like someone trying to be intimidating after being told off at a PTA meeting. While Mortal Kombat 4's tonal pivot wasn't a total disaster, it just came at the cost of everything that made Mortal Kombat fun. And in trying to make the series grow up, they accidentally made it forget who it was. However, this title must have some redeeming features, right? If there was one big gimmick Mortal Kombat 4 brought to the blood-soaked table, it was this. Weapons. Yes, each combatant could now summon a big stick, axe or knife from hammer spaces and start swinging like a drunk medieval cosplayer at a LARP convention. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? Well, temper that excitement, because in practice, Mortal Kombat 4's weapon system was less strategic depth and more press 2 buttons and hope nobody breathes on you. Every character had a signature weapon they could whip out mid-fight using a specific input, which was fun until you realised that weapons could be dropped, and anyone could pick them up. So now, Scorpion's undead ninja blade could end up in Sonya's hands, and suddenly the whole thing felt less like Mortal Kombat and more like a future Super Smash Bros. Game, with none of the polish or self-awareness. Even better, the weapons were slow, sluggish, glitchy. Swinging one felt like trying to row a canoe through jelly. Some of them did great damage, assuming you landed the hit and didn't get juggled into the Shadow Realm mid-swing. But this wasn't the only bold system tweak. No, Midway had also brought over the dialer combo system from Mortal Kombat 3, but with one beautiful, hilarious change. Nearly every character now shared the same combo string. That's right, why bother designing unique movesets when you can just copy and paste? Truly, we were living in the future. And because Mortal Kombat 3 had been plagued with infinite combo nonsense, Mortal Kombat 4 introduced the maximum damage cap. a handy little failsafe that forcibly ended your combo if it did too much damage. Which in fairness sounds smart, but in practice it just made the already clunky combat feel like it had an off switch and robbed the combo system of any flow. You get halfway through a juggle, hit the limit, and suddenly your opponents drop to the floor like they've been bored in submission. As for balance, well, if you're hoping for a finely tuned tournament grade fighter, I regret to inform you, this was more Mortal Kombat lottery. Characters like Reptile were reduced to borderline uselessness, his special moves had the startup of a fax machine and the recovery of a Victorian widow. It's not a balanced game, it's a fever dream of numbers, delays and untested hitboxes. In short, the combat of Mortal Kombat 4 tried to be modern, tactical and flashy, but instead of revolutionising the formula, it strapped some knives to it, tripped over a sidestep and landed flat on its face. Still, at least there was gore, lots of gore, even if half of it came with the frame rate of a PowerPoint presentation. So it's got that going for it. Then again, Mortal Kombat, when compared to other fighting game franchises, has never really been about being the most polished or competitive fighter. It's about spectacle and the ridiculous characters. So, what about those? Mortal Kombat 4's roster is the digital equivalent of rummaging through a charity shop bin, labelled Ninja Gods and all sorted failures. On paper it looks promising. Scorpion, Sub-Zero, Liu Kang, Raiden. All of the fan favourites were lovingly recreated as chunky polygons with the facial expressions of taxidermied mannequins. But then you got the newcomers, and things took a turn. Say hello to Fujin, the wind god, who looks like a washed up roadie from a Korn tribute band. Then there's Jarek, who's quite literally Diet Kano, complete with laser eye discount and none of the charm, and of course Tanya, a character whose only real crime is being less memorable than the pause button. To Midway's credit, squeezing these models into their shiny new 3D framework was no small feat. Each fighter was constructed from around 3,000 polygons, which at the time was considered cutting edge. Unfortunately, that cutting edge was often used to slash through your suspension of disbelief, especially when characters blinked like possessed ventriloquist dolls, or move like they just discovered knees. But the biggest offender? The final boss, Shinnok, who we mentioned earlier. Yes, Mortal Kombat 4 gave us its own big bad, and he was without question one of the least intimidating final bosses in fighting game history. This wasn't a towering monster like Goro, or a steroidal tyrant like Shao Kahn. No, this was a man who looked like a regional theatre Dracula playing a tax inspector in a leather coat. Ed Boon himself later admitted that making Shinnok the boss was a mistake. You don't say. He wasn't menacing, he wasn't memorable, his voice sounded like he was trying to order soup through a kazoo. Worse still, many of the characters' endings, particularly in the home version, came in the form of low-budget cutscenes, animated with all the passion of a GCSE media project. It's a shame really, Mortal Kombat had always been about big personalities and unforgettable villains, but Mortal Kombat 4, in its desperate dash to join the 3D era, delivered a cast that was somehow less charismatic with voice acting and motion than they were as 2D sprites grunting like pigs in a blender. After scraping the arcade's dignity into a bin, Mortal Kombat 4 then leapt gleefully into the home console space, flinging itself onto every platform that hadn't already begged for mercy. PlayStation, of course. Nintendo 64, why not? PC, sure, let's ruin that too. Game Boy Color, don't worry, we'll get to that. First, the headline act, the PlayStation version. Developed by Eurocom, this was a mostly faithful adaptation of the arcade original, which is both a compliment and an insult. Visually, it was a downgrade, the textures were muddier, the frame rate was choppier, and load times were so frequent they may as well have been advertised as a feature. But hey, it had full motion cutscenes, that means it was cinematic, right? Well, sort of. The FMVs were grainy, awkwardly directed, and voiced with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for budget audiobook erotica, but at least you could see something. Still, the Nintendo 64 version did one thing better. It ran at a smoother 60 frames per second. That means gameplay was technically faster and more responsive, assuming you could stomach the visuals, which looked like a Doom mod starring wax figures. Then there was the PC version, which let players plug Mortal Kombat 4 into their shiny beige towers and experience all the stuttering glory their graphics cards could handle. And the less said about the Game Boy Color port, the better. That abomination barely qualified as a fighting game. 2 buttons, no blood, characters that looked like they'd been drawn from memory by a tired accountant. It was Mortal Kombat in name only, like if someone printed the script of Saw on a tea towel and called it horror. But wait, Midway wasn't done yet. Enter Mortal Kombat Gold. This version added new characters like Katana, Baraka and Kung Lao, along with new stages. So far so good, except once again the execution was like trying to eat soup with a rake. Critics tore it apart for its jagged graphics, sluggish controls and general lack of polish, especially when Soul Calibur was sitting right there on the same system looking like it came from the future. Put simply, no matter which version you picked, you would trade in one flavour of disappointment for another. Mortal Kombat 4's journey to home consoles was ambitious, yes, but it was also an ambitious mess. At launch, Mortal Kombat 4 managed that rare and elusive gaming feat. It pleased absolutely no one in a consistent way. Critics were all over the place. Some applauded its efforts to modernise the franchise, while others treated it like Midway had handed them a polygonal dead rat and asked for a round of applause. Mainstream outlets, perhaps still blinded by brand loyalty, gave the game middling to positive reviews. A bold leap into 3D, they cried. New gameplay innovations, they cheered. Finally, weapons, they squealed. Presumably before being smacked unconscious by one in the game. And yes, there was a certain excitement about seeing Mortal Kombat in 3 dimensions for the first time, even if those dimensions came covered in jagged textures and jank. But the cracks began to show, almost immediately. Electronic Gaming Monthly famously declared it the worst Mortal Kombat game ever made. Others bemoaned the stilted animations, repetitive combos, and blocky character models that aged faster than a banana in a sauna. And yet, despite the complaints, it sold. Oh, did it sell. Thanks to aggressive marketing and the sheer gravitational pull of Mortal Kombat's brand in the 90s, Mortal Kombat 4 moved units like a champ. It didn't matter that the combat felt like shadow boxing inside a tumble dryer. The fans came anyway. Coin purses clutched tightly, hoping desperately that this one would finally be the one. Retrospectively, however, Mortal Kombat 4's legacy had become a battlefield. Some insist it's criminally underrated. They talk about the darker tone, the atmospheric music, the ambition. Others, let's call them sane. They see Mortal Kombat 4 for what it was. A deeply compromised title stuck in a generational no man's land. Too clunky for the new age, too limited for the old. A relic of a franchise trying to have its brutality and bash it too. Still, as far as misunderstood failures go, Mortal Kombat 4 is fascinating. It's not a game without merit. It's just one where every good idea seems to be immediately undercut by another baffling decision. A swing and miss, a fatality where the spine comes out, but so does the credibility. This was the game that marked the end of Mortal Kombat's arcade era. The last time players would crowd around a machine in a dingy shopping centre praying the joystick wasn't sticky from cola, or something worse. Mortal Kombat 4 was the series' final coin-op outing before everything went fully domestic, leaving behind the glorious communal violence of the 90s for the warm, lonely embrace of a home console. And with that departure came another funeral, the death of digitised actors. Gone were the gloriously cheesy, real-life martial artists in spray-painted costumes, replaced now by jagged 3D models. It was the end of Mortal Kombat's original visual identity, ripped out like a spine and thrown into the pit of early 3D experimentation. But for all its faults, Mortal Kombat 4 laid the groundwork for the future. Without it, there would be no Deadly Alliance, no Deception. It was a stepping stone made of cracked concrete and broken dreams, but a stepping stone nonetheless. It taught Midway valuable lessons like maybe don't reuse your boss's skull projectile for another character. Maybe don't replace your towering final boss with someone who looks like a DJ at a vampire bar. And maybe, just maybe, don't release 4 ports of the same game when none of them are particularly good. Mortal Kombat 4 wasn't the graceful evolution Mortal Kombat needed. It was the messy puberty it couldn't avoid. A time of gangly limbs, embarrassing decisions, and unfortunate haircuts. Yes, it was flawed, it was janky, it was weird, but it survived. And in the blood-slicked world of Mortal Kombat, that alone earned you a place in the temple. So Mortal Kombat 4, was it a disaster? Yes. Was it innovative? Also yes. Was it ugly, weirdly balanced technically, unstable, and creatively confused? Absolutely. And yet somehow it mattered. It's easy to mock Mortal Kombat 4, in fact it's been tremendously easy, thank you. But it took risks, it tried new things, it dared to be something else, darker, 3D'er, and disastrously ambitious. And yes, it fell flat in the process, but at least it fell forward. So if you've ever looked at Mortal Kombat 4 and thought, what on earth were they thinking? The answer is simple, they were thinking about the future. They just accidentally built it out of jank, triangles, and the broken dreams of thousands of arcade operators. But hey, sometimes you've got to crawl through the polygonal muck just to find out what a next-gen fatality shouldn't look like. Mortal Kombat Special Forces is perhaps the most controversial title in the whole series' entire lineage. This was Midway's second attempt at spinning the Mortal Kombat universe into grander horizons, and it belly flopped so hard you can still hear the splash echoing through history. Starring Jax, everyone's favourite man with biceps bigger than your average hatchback, this PlayStation exclusive was meant to be the bold new direction that would prove the franchise had legs beyond one-on-one combat, but instead, it proved that those legs were made of jelly. Today the game is routinely held up as one of the worst Mortal Kombat products ever made, a laughable mess of clunky shooting, barren corridors and development drama so catastrophic it makes Mythology Sub-Zero look like a finely polished masterpiece by comparison. However, to understand why Mortal Kombat Special Forces came into being, we must first look back to the late 90s, a period when the franchise was trying to convince the world it was still the king of fighting games, even as the crown slipped precariously off its blood-soaked brow. To get our timeline right, prior to Special Forces release, let me remind you that Mortal Kombat 4 had landed with all the grace of a drunken bar fight, attempting to drag the series into 3D with polygons that looked like they'd been chiseled from granite, and less said about the cinematic war crime known as Mortal Kombat Annihilation the better. By 1998, Midway desperately needed a win. Enter the grand plan. After Mythology Sub-Zero stumbled onto shelves in 1997 with a sort of critical reception usually reserved for contagious diseases, co-creator John Tobias was still determined to expand Mortal Kombat into a multimedia juggernaut. His vision was nothing less than a sprawling series of character-focused spin-offs, games that would flesh out the lore of individual combatants and turn them into headline stars. Sub-Zero had already been given his frosty solo outing, but hot on his heels were planned titles for Liu Kang, Baraka, Raiden, and of course the military pairing of Jax and Sonya Blade. Special Forces therefore wasn't some oddball one-off, but rather the next step in what was meant to be an entire anthology of Mortal Kombat adventures. On paper it sounded ambitious, even sensible. Take fan favourite fighters and build whole adventures around them, expanding the universe in ways the mainline fighting games couldn't. In practice, however, Midway were trying to launch this grand experiment at the exact moment the brand itself was wobbling. Mythologies had been ridiculed, Annihilation had torched the series' credibility on the big screen, and Mortal Kombat 4 had done little to convince critics that the franchise could thrive in the PlayStation era. Into this uncertain environment marched Jax, cybernetic, fists clenched, ready to carry the weight of the entire franchise on his shoulders. Spoiler, it did not go well. The origins of Special Forces can be traced back to John Tobias himself, the comic book-minded co-creator of Mortal Kombat who, despite Mythologies being laughed out of the room, still believed in the dream of spin-offs. His brainchild? A fully 3D, free-roaming action-adventure that would play like Tomb Raider meets Mortal Kombat, complete with climbing, swimming, firearms, and an all-new combat engine built from the ground up. This wasn't meant to be some half-hearted cash grab. Tobias pitched it as the technical showpiece that would put Mortal Kombat back on top, and finally prove it could stand tall outside of the fighting arena. The first public glimpse came at E3 1999, where the Nintendo 64 version was wheeled out for eager eyes. Unfortunately, the reaction was less fatality and more friendship. Critics were unimpressed. Midway started to get cold feet, and suddenly this bold new direction was being dragged back for retooling before it even had the chance to breathe. Still, worse was yet to come. In September 1999, the unthinkable happened. John Tobias himself walked away from Midway, and he didn't go alone. A chunk of the core development team, including lead artists Dave Michicic, who had been experimenting with revolutionary water refraction effects, and Josh Shui, responsible for much of the 3D modelling, who departed with him to form their own studio, Studio Gigante. That's right, the man who had spearheaded this ambitious new project left before it even reached the finish line, taking with him the people responsible for its technical and artistic vision. Imagine if Ed Boon had turned up to work one morning to find the entire team had defected to work on Tekken. That was basically the equivalent of what Midway was dealing with here. The cascade of problems that followed was as inevitable as a scorpion spear to the face. With both the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 teams gutted, Midway had no choice but to mash the survivors into one skeleton crew and cancel the other versions outright. The Nintendo 64 port, dead. The Dreamcast version, which had been quietly planned, also scrapped. All resources were funneled into producing a single PlayStation release, and even that was held together with more duct tape than design. Still, this was just the start. There were even worse changes in store for the product. If you played this one, you will unfortunately remember this embarrassing outing as Jack's game. However, this was not always planned to be exclusively the case. As mentioned earlier, development cuts would be made to the title, so therefore Sonya Blade, who was originally meant to be the co-star alongside Jax, was removed completely, despite being plastered across magazine covers and promotional material all over the place. In fact, prototype footage later leaked of ex-developer Josh Sui even showing us Sonya in full firefights against a black dragon, complete with unique animations and voice acting, all of which ended up on the cutting room floor. Cabal's entire subplot exploring his break from the Black Dragon and role as an informant was slashed to pieces. The level count was reduced from 7 down to 5, and ambitious mechanics like swimming, climbing and free-roaming camera systems were quietly abandoned. What began life as an expansive Tomb Raider with fatalities was steadily stripped down until all that remained was corridors with guns starring Jax. In the end, Midway didn't just lose its creative director, it lost the very game he was trying to make. From the moment you pick up the controller, it becomes clear that Mortal Kombat Special Forces is not a fighting game, nor is it really an action game. It's more of a cautionary tale disguised as a video game. The camera hovers above Jax in a stiff third-person perspective that desperately wants to be Metal Gear Solid, but ends up looking more like a discount action figure wobbling around a bargain bin diorama. There is no jump button whatsoever, a decision that feels less like a design choice and more like the developers simply gave up halfway through and decided Jax's still legs weren't up to the task. After all, why leap majestically across chasms, wherein you can trudge around grey corridors like a man looking for the toilet in a nightclub? Combat itself revolves around the primitive combo system, with 4 face buttons for punches and kicks, a block and a turbo modifier that allows Jax to pull off special moves like ground pounds and charging punches. These abilities are tied to an energy meter which drains when used and only refills by smacking enemies in the face. To spice things up, there's a progression system that lets Jax learn new combos with experience points. The result? A list of attack strings with names so gloriously ridiculous they sound like rejected album titles from a 1990s nu metal band. Get some sucker, taking out the trash, the shocker. Yes, really. The irony is that most of these advanced combos were almost useless in practice, far too slow or complex to pull off in the middle of a fight. As most players discovered, you'd end up spamming the early super uppercuts forever because everything else was either too fiddly or too ineffective to bother with. It's as though Midway knew the game was doomed and thought they could distract you with comedy combo names, hoping you'd laugh too hard to notice nothing actually worked. But wait, there's more. Unlike Mythologies, Special Forces arms you with a vast arsenal of firearms. Machine guns, shotguns, sniper rifles, grenade launchers, even rocket launchers. Sounds exciting, right? Wrong. The auto-aim system locks on as long as you vaguely face an enemy's direction, which would be fine if it weren't sabotaged by the game's hideous fog and laughable draw distance. But these are just a few of the issues with the gameplay that can be experienced when playing this unholy relic. When it comes to using your weapons, ammunition management only made matters worse. Guns were designed for tactical situations, but ammo was so scarce that you'd constantly run dry mid-fight, forced to go back to clumsy melee attacks against machine gun nests. And when you did have ammo, the sniper rifle exposed a fatal flaw in the engine. Zooming in didn't actually improve draw distance at all. Enemies could see you long before the fog cleared, enough for you to see them. As IGN memorably put it, the game was utterly unplayable whenever a machine gun entered the frame. And then there's the camera, the true final boss of Mortal Kombat Special Forces. It is zoomed in far too close for ranged battles, constantly snags on walls, and has the uncanny ability to hide enemies just long enough for them to ambush you from off screen. Mythologies may have had its infamous turn button, but at least you could see what was killing you. In the end, Special Forces is less a game and more an endurance test. Mythologies was clunky and cruel, but it had ambition frozen under the ice. Trailing Monks, which later would prove that a Mortal Kombat action spin-off could actually work, blending combos, co-op and fatalities into something magical. But Special Forces, does this one have any saving graces? What about the story, for instance? Story-wise, Special Forces positions itself as a gritty prequel, pitting Jax against his eternal nemesis, Kano and the Black Dragon organization. On paper, this should have been perfect, a down-to-earth military thriller exploring Jax's origins and his vendetta against the criminal underworld. In practice, it boiled down to Jax hates Kano, Kano hates Jax, and that's about as deep as it gets. Subtlety was not invited to the party. Worse still, the game bungled its own continuity in ways that would have Ed Boon facepalming into the nether realm. Special Forces cheerfully presents Jax as already rocking his iconic cybernetic arms, except canonically, he doesn't get them until Mortal Kombat 3, so the game essentially turned him into Robocop years before he was supposed to be. Later titles had to awkwardly retcon this blunder by insisting his arms were enhancements rather than replacements, which is a bit like saying the Titanic merely spruced up its hull with an iceberg. That said, Special Forces did manage to accidentally contribute something of value to Mortal Kombat lore. It marked the first ever appearance of Tremor, the earth-wielding ninja who would later be revived as a DLC character in Mortal Kombat 10. Back in 2000, however, he was just another palette-swapped extra on the Black Dragon payroll, about as memorable as wet cardboard. Still, fans eventually adopted him, proving that even the most forgettable footnotes can claw their way into relevance if given enough time and a few particle effects. The game also fleshed out the Black Dragon, at least in theory. Instead of Kano being a lone lunatic with a laser eye, Special Forces introduced an entire rogues gallery of operatives like No Face and Tazia, names that sound less like hardened mercenaries and more like rejected G.I. Joe figures. Sadly, the execution was so half-hearted that these characters slipped into obscurity, leaving Tremor as the only survivor of the lot. The idea of exploring the Black Dragon's global operations could have given Mortal Kombat a fascinating expansion of its universe, but here it was a little more than background noise, a wasted opportunity buried under empty levels and poor storytelling. So yes, Special Forces technically expanded the lore, but in the most awkward and accidental way possible, by tripping over itself and spilling a few new ideas onto the floor. After staggering through development hell, Mortal Kombat Special Forces finally limped onto store shelves in June in the year 2000 in North America, with a European release following that September. What was once promised as a multi-platform blockbuster, as mentioned earlier, ended up crawling out as a PlayStation exclusive, and even then only barely alive. For reasons known only to Midway's marketing department, Special Forces was bizarrely dressed up with a tacky 1970s action movie flavour, complete with corny spy-style cinematics that clashed horribly with the supposed military realism of Jack's mission. It was as if they tried to make Shaft combat, only to bottle it halfway through, leaving players confused and unimpressed. Even Midway seemed to know they had a dud on their hands. What began as a bold, confident campaign was quietly scaled back to the bare minimum. The game shoved out at a budget price in what felt less like a release and more like a mercy killing. Commercially, the game was an outright disaster. Across this entire lifetime, Special Forces managed to shift around 210,000 copies worldwide. A pitiful number compared to Mortal Kombat's glory days. For perspective, Mortal Kombat 3 sold more copies in its opening weekend than Special Forces managed across its entire miserable existence. Midway had bet on Jax carrying the franchise into the next millennium. Instead, he barely carried it out of the bargain bin, but the reception would be even worse than the marketing. When Mortal Kombat Special Forces finally limped into players' hands in mid-2000, the critics unsheathed their pens like katanas, and they did not hold back. IGN slapped the game with a withering 3 out of 10, declaring it unworthy of purchase even at a bargain bin price. GameSpot went one better, or rather worse, with a 2.1, savaging the holes in the plot and slapdash level design, but it was Electronic Gaming Monthly who truly finished the job, detonating the fatality with a brutal 1.5 out of 10. To put it bluntly, the game wasn't reviewed, it was executed. On Metacritic, the aggregated score hit a miserable 28 out of 100, cementing its place as the lowest rated Mortal Kombat game of all time. Yes, even lower than Mythology Sub-Zero. Rather hilariously, even a few scraps of praise were unintentionally damning. IGN noted the bronzer gleaming off the bodies and a handful of novelty license plates hidden in the environments, as though shiny forearms and Easter eggs were enough to redeem the rest. Other critics said the first few unarmed fistfights were fun, right up until the game handed you a machine gun and collapsed into chaos. And of course, Sonya's absence loomed large. The game that had once been sold as a buddy cop adventure now felt half finished, and fans never let Midway forget it. Retrospectives since have been no kinder. Hardcore Gaming 101 called it a game that crumbles under the weight of its nonsensical design decisions. YouTubers drag it out whenever they need easy content about the worst games ever made, and fans generally mention it in the same tone they'd use to recall a traumatic accident they once saw on the motorway. In the court of public opinion, Special Forces has never been pardoned. Perhaps the most devastating consequence, however, was what it did to Midway's grand spin-off experiment. Between mythologies of Special Forces, two of the worst received games in the series' history, the whole character-focused adventure concept was killed stone dead. It would take 5 long years before Midway dared try again, and when they did, they abandoned Tobias' vision entirely, opting instead for the co-op brawler Shaolin Monks, which finally succeeded in doing what these earlier disasters had only dreamed of. In other words, Special Forces didn't just fail, it poisoned the well. And yet, time has a funny way of turning even the ugliest fossils into collectors' curios. To understand the true importance of Mortal Kombat Gold, one must first cast one's mind back to the turn of the millennium, a time when Sega's Dreamcast came crashing onto shop shelves with all the pomp and ceremony of a revolutionary device destined to drag the industry into a bold new age. September the 9th, 1999, that hallowed launch day in North America delivered a smorgasbord of titles designed to showcase the system's prowess, and among them sat Midway's latest foray into bloody theatrics. Yet unlike the hasty, compromised conversions that often accompanied new hardware launches, Mortal Kombat Gold stood tall as a Dreamcast exclusive released in tandem with the machine itself. But let us make one thing abundantly clear. This was no mere port. This was not the Mortal Kombat 4 you may have seen limping awkwardly onto the Nintendo 64, or groaning under the weight of load screens on the PlayStation. No, this was, as it was so aptly described at the time, an enhanced version of Mortal Kombat 4, what could have been the definitive evolution of the classic era. A version that went beyond simply transferring assets, instead embracing the full might of Sega's new silicon and using it to craft a sharper, smoother, more formidable experience. Indeed, in terms of sheer fidelity, the game was impressive. It boasted character models built to mirror the arcade's 3,000 polygon designs, though later analysis suggests that these were in fact optimized versions of the original arcade geometry. Regardless, on the Dreamcast they strutted and clashed with even greater fluidity, running at a smooth 60 frames per second compared to the arcade's 57. It was, in short, the most faithful realisation of Midway's bloody vision, a Dreamcast jewel that proved the new machine was capable of hosting the definitive Mortal Kombat experience, and yet, bizarrely, it is the very jewel that has been left unpolished and hidden away in the vaults of history. Of course, what truly distinguished Mortal Kombat Gold from its immediate predecessor was not merely its sharper visuals or silky frame rate, but the way it expanded the very cast of combatants themselves. Where Mortal Kombat 4 had left fans grumbling about omissions, Gold sought to mend those wounds by restoring 6 familiar faces to the fray: Kitana, Mileena, Cyrax, Kung Lao, Baraka, and tucked away as a hidden treat, the robotic menace of Sector. Their presence alone would be enough to earn applause, yet Eurocom and Midway did not simply dump the old warriors into the roster as nostalgic fan service. They were fighters who also came with completely new cinematic endings that expanded the series' storyline. This in turn granted Mortal Kombat Gold a weight within the lore that stretched beyond its reputation as an upgraded port. These endings were not frivolous extras, but narrative bricks laid into the great bloody edifice of the Mortal Kombat saga. Nowhere was that clearer than with Scorpion, whose climactic tale in Gold directly set up Deadly Alliance, the next great chapter in the franchise. In other words, the Dreamcast exclusive was not simply tinkering at the margins, but actively shaping canon, quietly linking the late 90s arcade era to the grand PlayStation 2 revival that would follow. And yet, despite this clear significance, the so-called Legacy Collection pretends that none of it ever happened. If the enriched roster was not enough to convince players that Mortal Kombat Gold was more than a mere reissue, then its expanded gameplay mechanics certainly hammered the point home. Chief among these was the new Weapon Select feature, which allowed fighters to choose from the full arsenal of blades, hammers and exotic implements before the first punch was even thrown. Unlike Mortal Kombat 4, where weapons were tied to specific costumes, here the choice was yours. A small but significant change that shifted strategy to the character select screen itself. By baking strategic choice into the pre-match ritual and marrying it with dynamic arenas that encouraged improvisation, Mortal Kombat Gold elevated the brutality into something approaching theatre, a deadly dance in which every weapon, every stone, every disembodied skull could become the instrument of victory. And as if expanded rosters and deepened mechanics were not enough, Mortal Kombat Gold further indulged its audience with secrets and hidden delights. The kind of arcane trinkets that gave late 90s fighters their enduring mystique. The most celebrated gateway into this treasure chest was a cheat menu, accessed by sacred incantations of controller inputs on the title screen. Key in the sequence and you would be rewarded not with a mere visual confirmation, but with the booming voice of the announcer himself declaring "outstanding," a soundbite that instantly assured you of your entry into a clandestine world of options, codes and chaos. Within this hidden vault lay the means to unlock some of Mortal Kombat's most iconic warriors. Towering bosses and secret assassins could be brought into the fold, from the hulking Goro to the spectral noob Cybot, from the cybernetic Sector to the morbidly comic curiosity known as Meat. The latter, delightfully absurd in both concept and execution, could be earned only through perseverance. Such challenges lent the game a sense of playground legend, as whispers of unlocked conditions spread among players like contraband knowledge. Even the franchise's trademark fatalities were given a fresh twist, with accessibility trumping execution. By toggling the right option in this hidden menu, the most gruesome finishes could be performed with a single button press. To quote the instruction outright, press high punch, perform their first fatality. What had once demanded encyclopedic memory and flawless inputs could now be triggered at will, allowing even the clumsiest novice to bask in the cathartic glory of a decapitation. Thus, beneath its polished surface, Mortal Kombat Gold contained a labyrinth of secrets that made it feel alive, unpredictable and endlessly replayable. It was a game that practically dared its players to dig deeper, and rewarded them handsomely when they did. As briefly touched on earlier, beyond its roster and stylistic flourishes, Mortal Kombat Gold also stood as a technical showcase, a gleaming demonstration of what Sega's Dreamcast could deliver in the dying days of the 20th century. Mortal Kombat Gold runs at 60 frames per second with a 640 by 480 resolution, even higher than the Mortal Kombat 4 coin-op. This alone places the title in a rarefied category. The technical braggery did not stop there though. The system pumped out over 1 million polygons per second, close to 1.5 million at times, at that 60 frames, ensuring that the arenas were crisp, characters smooth, and animation fluid in a way few contemporaries could rival. Throw in bilinear filtering and coloured lighting effects, and what you had was an aesthetic leap forward that lent the game a lustre absent from its Nintendo 64 and PlayStation cousins. Perhaps most striking for players at the time, however, was what was missing: loading screens. Unlike its CD-based rivals, Mortal Kombat Gold sprang to life with virtually no interruptions. As the promotional boast went, Dreamcast Mortal Kombat Gold does not load at all. You'll never catch now loading, a claim that for once was not marketing hyperbole, but cold, hard truth. And then there was the matter of post-launch support, an almost alien concept in the late 1990s. The infamous Red Disc revision, released as version 2.0 in October 1999, fixed earlier crashes, tightened memory card saving, and smoothed over rough edges. The new pressing, identifiable with a red tinted disc with a green hot new sticker, is the one to grab. In this sense, Mortal Kombat Gold was not only technically ahead of its peers, but even flirted with modern notion of patch culture, long before such practices became an industry standard. So if you are looking to pick up a physical copy of the game for yourself, you might want to pay attention to which version you are actually paying for. But there's more reasons to love this one beyond its technical sophistication. No great Mortal Kombat game would be complete without its distinctive auditory identity, and Mortal Kombat Gold carried that torch with surprising fidelity as the franchise leapt from 2 dimensions into 3. Longtime composer Dan Toasty Forden himself described the musical palette of the era as a heady concoction of ethnic drumming, synthetic basses, and exotic instruments, a blend that gave a series a soundscape as unmistakable as its fountains of digital gore. Where other fighters of the time often succumbed to anonymous guitar loops or forgettable techno, Gold clung to the strange and atmospheric, crafting a sonic backdrop that reinforced Mortal Kombat's otherworldly brutality. For this reason, even in contemporary assessments, the game was praised for preserving that unique auditory DNA. While the Dreamcast's technical muscle ensured that every crunch, scream and sickening splatter rang out with crisp clarity, it was the strange marriage of pounding drums and eerie melodies that ensured Mortal Kombat Gold felt like more than just another fighter with a new coat of paint. It sounded like Mortal Kombat Gold, and that perhaps more than any polygon count proved that the soul of the series had survived a transition into the so-called 128-bit generation. Of course, no discussion of Mortal Kombat Gold would be complete without mention of the Phantom Fighter who nearly was, Belloc. Unlike the shadowy whispers of Playground myth, this one was very real, a hulking demonic warrior who came within an air's breadth of appearing on the Dreamcast's disc. His existence slipped into the public eye when 6 leaked in-engine shots surfaced after an accident at Eurocom, showing the character fully modelled and tantalisingly close to completion. Community research generally places him at around 90% complete. Unfinished, yes, but close enough to haunt the imagination of fans decades later. So why, you may ask, was this fearsome combatant excised from the final roster? The answer lies not in technical limitations, but in creative politics. Belloc was cast aside at the 11th hour. Midway themselves pulled the plug, citing that the character was not created by the Mortal Kombat designers, and thus unworthy of admission into the official pantheon. In other words, Belloc was condemned not by his lack of readiness, but by questions of legitimacy, the dubious crime of being born outside the sacred inner circle. As the final pit scream echoes and the finish screen fades, what remains is more than nostalgia for joystick jabs and fatality fanfare. The journey through Mortal Kombat's early era throws into sharp relief how a simple concept, 2 fighters, a timer, a round, exploded into an arena of spectacle, licensing and identity crisis. Whether you watched the sprite-by-sprite innovations of Mortal Kombat 1 through 3, experienced the bloat of ambition of 4, or winced at the missteps of special forces and mythologies, one truth stands. Even icons can wobble when the formula fractures. So next time you watch someone explode in a shower of gore, spare a thought for what came before it, and what might just be waiting around the next corner. Anyway, if you like this long boy of an upload, you'll probably appreciate my coverage of Street Fighter 2's 4 Grandmasters. Yeah! Cheerio!